Chapter 121, The Gryffindor Holy Sword and the Twin Serpent Staff. With an open mind, one can truly appreciate the vastness of the world. Ever since Atticus Blaine first heard the legend of the Slytherin Chamber of Secrets from a fellow student at Hogwarts, a lingering question had taken root in his heart. Why would Salazar Slytherin, arguably the most powerful of the Hogwarts founders, create a chamber intended to harm Muggleborns or half-blood wizards? Was the preservation of pure-blood lineage truly his guiding principle in the pursuit of magical mastery? These doubts persisted until a few months ago, when Atticus finally laid eyes on the Slytherin Chamber of Secrets. It was then he began to suspect that Slytherin's intentions might have been more complex than the rumors suggested. The presence of the Twin Serpent Staff, radiating an unsettling aura, only reinforced this belief. Although Atticus still couldn't decipher the mysteries concealed behind the chamber's door, it was clear that Slytherin's decision to house a basilisk in the outer chamber was far from straightforward. Suddenly, a loud explosion jolted Atticus from his thoughts. He watched as the Twin Serpent Staff, upon nearing Gryffindor's hand, erupted in a burst of gray plasma. The force of the blast sent Gryffindor stumbling back several steps, nearly toppling from the altar, his palm marked by burns. As Rowena predicted, the indomitable snake staff recognizes only its true master, Gryffindor remarked, shaking his hand with a mischievous grin, showing no sign of defeat. Typical of the founder of Gryffindor House, Atticus thought, his expression darkening. It seems I can't bring you a gift, Salazar, Gryffindor said with a hint of regret, blowing on his scorched palm. He then turned his attention to the edge of the altar, where a sword with a golden hilt and a blade that gleamed coldly was embedded in the steps. The brave and fearless monarch of Camelot, the sword of Arthur Pendragon, the holy sword of broken steel, Gryffindor exclaimed, abandoning his quest to present a gift to his friend. He crouched before the holy sword, his eyes alight with awe. What a formidable warrior, Gryffindor mused regretfully. If only we had lived in the same era, we would have been each other's greatest rivals and most understanding friends. As Gryffindor spoke, the holy sword of broken steel, which had long suppressed the power of the snake staff with its aura of faith and courage, began to tremble, eager to break free from its earthly confines. "You wish to join me?" Gryffindor asked, seemingly understanding the sword's vibrations. He was surprised, but then nodded in comprehension. "Indeed, a sword like you belongs on the battlefield, not buried in this dark world. But your duty." Gryffindor glanced at the snake staff, which continued to exude a deathly aura despite the holy swords and Merlin's magic suppression, clearly torn. Before Gryffindor could decide, Atticus, observing the scene, felt a subtle shift in his thoughts. He alternated his gaze between Gryffindor's silver sword and the legendary holy sword of broken steel, a theory forming in his mind. "Well, old friend," Gryffindor said, turning to the sword, "it seems I must ask for your help." Sure enough, after a brief hesitation, Gryffindor gazed at his sword with a tinge of regret. Clang! The broken steel holy sword, silent for centuries, suddenly hovered in midair, radiating a brilliant golden light. The empty hall of the temple, and even the entire island of Avalon suspended in the sky, began to tremble violently. The two basilisks on the double snake staff writhed along the golden scepter, spewing strands of gray magic that seemed repulsive to life from their gaping, fang-filled mouths. Gryffindor's red hair whipped wildly around him. In response to the agitated snake staff, the powerful aura emanating from his muscular form seemed capable of splitting the heavens and the earth. He thrust the sword into a slot in the ground, leaning on the hilt with both hands, channeling a continuous flow of magma-like red magic into the earth through his saber. Atticus Blaine, standing nearby, observed the ancient scene unfolding before him. Despite the barrier of thousands of years that prevented him from feeling Gryffindor's indescribably powerful magic, his emotions were stirred. Under Gryffindor's intense suppression, the tremors quickly subsided, and the searing magic gradually spread to the double snake staff along the altar's crevices, forming an alchemical pattern around it. Hiss! The two basilisks entwined around the scepter seemed to come alive, their orange eyes filled with intense resentment. Yet, under Gryffindor's pressure, they reluctantly closed their eyes. Swish! The broken steel holy sword, emanating golden magic and light, quivered in midair before slicing through the air to land in Gryffindor's open palm. Is Gryffindor's famous sword actually King Arthur's broken steel sword? Atticus Blaine's face was a mask of disbelief, feeling as though his entire worldview had been overturned. He muttered to himself in confusion. The documents clearly state that Gryffindor's sword was forged by goblins. The two swords don't even look alike. Since entering this secret realm, Atticus felt as if he had returned to his early days at Hogwarts, filled with questions and mysteries. However, his doubts about Gryffindor's sword were soon answered by the events that followed. When Gryffindor grasped the holy sword of broken steel, a fierce clash erupted between the golden and red magic. The sword, imbued with the will of its original owner, would not submit to anyone without a challenge. To possess it, one must first conquer it. The endless interplay of golden and red light blurred Atticus's vision, even distorting the traces of Gryffindor's presence that had lingered for millennia. The figure of the man, as fiery as molten lava, flickered and blurred like a television screen, disrupted by strong electromagnetic interference. Gryffindor's hearty laughter echoed in Atticus's ears. In the blurred light and shadow, Gryffindor, with his back to Atticus, raised a piece of molten metal and declared with vigor, "I will have the most skilled goblin recast your form. You will bear a new name and continue your legend." As Gryffindor's journey through the secret realm neared its end, he reached into his wizard's robe and tossed a stone pillar. Its surface cracked into the air. Atticus's eyes widened as he recognized the identical stone pillar in his hand, recalling Gryffindor's original words. It seemed Gryffindor could navigate the space within and outside the secret realm through this stone pillar, just as he had when entering the secret. Atticus Blaine squeezed his body into the hazy, twisted space, feeling as if he were on the verge of departure. Just as he thought he was about to bid farewell to the time mark of Gryffindor, Godric Gryffindor suddenly halted his advance. He turned his head to look at Atticus with a smile. Since the apparition of Gryffindor had appeared, their eyes had crossed paths numerous times during their journey together. However, Gryffindor's gaze never seemed to focus on Atticus. Instead, it passed through him, as if looking at something beyond. But at this moment, his gaze seemed to transcend time, landing directly on Atticus Blaine, who existed thousands of years in the future. Atticus realized this immediately. His breath quickened, and his eyes widened in fear. He recalled Gryffindor's reassuring words, "Don't be afraid, follow me," and became almost certain that Godric Gryffindor had somehow managed to see him across the millennia. In Salazar's Chamber of Secrets, there are answers to all doubts. End of this chapter. Chapter 122, Chess Pieces. Whoa! With the departure of Godric Gryffindor, the space within the altar seemed to transform. The influence he had exerted vanished like a mirage, as if the sea had receded in an instant. When the light and shadows settled, a thick layer of dust covered the altar's ground. The surrounding time barriers remained intact, and Vitya still stood at the grand gate of the temple, gazing towards the swamp, oblivious to Atticus Blaine's quiet entrance into the altar. He was now just a step away from the druid's coveted double snake staff. Atticus stared blankly at the silver sword embedded in the ground, Gryffindor's words echoing in his mind. Salazar Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets. The answers to all doubts are there. His breathing grew heavy. Ever since he had unlocked the memories he had sealed away, he knew he would eventually face the need to open the Chamber of Secrets. Yet, he hadn't anticipated that Gryffindor's revelation would be the catalyst. All doubts, he pondered. How many unresolved questions plagued Atticus's mind? Too many to count. Before entering this secret realm, his sole aim was to uncover why he was entangled in the Druid prophecy and the mystery of the land of Merlin's eternal rest that Vitya had mentioned. However, instead of resolving these issues, his journey had only compounded his uncertainties. It was clear that the Big Four were conspiring to destroy the Double Snake Staff. Salazar Slytherin had created the Chamber of Secrets and bred a real basilisk for this purpose. Before entering this secret realm, Gryffindor might have learned of Atticus's existence through some means or prophecy. Once inside, he aided Atticus with unprecedented methods, bringing him closer to the Double Snake Staff. Why do the prophecies of the Big Four and the Druids believe I can wield the snake staff? Atticus recalled Gryffindor's words. The indestructible double snake staff only submits to its true master. He hadn't forgotten the magical eruption when Gryffindor attempted to pick up the staff. The force was so powerful that even Gryffindor couldn't withstand it. In the center of the altar, the mysterious scepter, sealed for over a dozen centuries and thought to exist only in myth, silently met Atticus's gaze. Why do they seek to destroy you, even planning 1,000 years in advance? The traces left by two of the Big Four were now before Atticus. But what of Rowena Ravenclaw and Helga Hufflepuff? He had a strong sense that if he continued his investigation, their roles would eventually become clear. Beyond these questions, the murals on the massive stone wall in the back hall presented further enigmas. How did the double snake staff end up in Morgan Le Fay's hands, becoming the holy vessel of Druidism? Additionally, the shadow within Morgan Le Fay, mentioned in rumors and murals, remained a mystery. At the mural's end, the only surviving Merlin acquired the temple from an unknown source and left King Arthur's broken steel holy sword to suppress the double snake staff. What happened after that? Did Merlin vanish into time? The conspiracy behind these puzzles loomed over Atticus like a vast net, leaving him feeling oppressed and suffocated. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and he even considered abandoning his quest, focusing solely on studying magic, improving his strength, and relinquishing the desire to uncover the truth. Since Gryffindor's time, this ancient altar had once again been visited by wizards. Thousands of years had passed, and the magical circle left by Gryffindor was now riddled with cracks. Many of its magical nodes were blocked, causing the flow of magic to become erratic. This disruption led to the artifact's power leaking out, seeping into the earth and spreading a malevolent magic that withered life. If Atticus Blaine chose to abandon his efforts and leave the snake staff behind, Avalon Island would eventually succumb to this corrosive magic, and the space itself would be lost in the boundless void. Perhaps feeling weary, Vidya, who stood at the temple's entrance, ceased her watch. She glanced at the altar in the hall, obscured by hazy barriers that concealed its contents. With her arms wrapped around her knees, she sat on the white stone threshold. Alone, Vidya's emerald eyes reflected confusion, and her slender, delicate figure exuded a sense of desolate helplessness. Atticus observed the young priestess from behind the barrier. She seemed to be about the age of a recent Hogwarts graduate, and he sighed heavily, feeling a pang of sympathy. He was uncertain if the Druids understood what lay on the altar beyond the barrier, or where they had gotten the idea that the two snake staff could free them from their plight. After witnessing the battle depicted on the mural and the power Gryffindor had wielded, he did not doubt the staff's potential. However, various clues suggested that the situation was far more complex. He feared that both he and the Druid sect were mere pawns in a larger, mysterious scheme. Should he escape or confront the situation now? Atticus surveyed the Grand Temple with an impassive expression, weighing his options. He knew this decision would shape his destiny, leading him down one of two divergent paths. After a moment of hesitation, Atticus shook his head lightly, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. Was there really any need to hesitate? He had already made his choice. Standing before the golden scepter, Atticus felt his heart race and his breath quicken. Throughout his travels in the wizarding world, he had encountered many powerful magical artifacts that had etched their names in history. Yet, he had always shown little interest in them, even gifting the Ravenclaw diadem to Dumbledore. The true reason for this was Atticus's belief that true power lay within oneself, and any power derived from external objects could ultimately be taken away. But this scepter evoked a different feeling in Atticus. If he could harness the power of the snake staff, he would become an invincible force in the contemporary magical world. Neither Albus Dumbledore, the greatest white wizard of their time, nor Voldemort, lurking in the shadows and waiting for his chance to return, nor the disillusioned First Dark Lord, Gellert Grindelwald, would pose a threat. With the power of the two snake staff, Atticus could even unify the magical civilizations across the globe, establish a grand magical dynasty, and venture into the Muggle world, ultimately becoming the true monarch of Earth. In a contemporary magical world where the power of wizards had waned, if Atticus set his mind to it, with his wisdom and the power of the snake staff, no one would be able to stand in his way. End of this chapter. Chapter 123, Breaking the Shackles. A person's ambition often grows in tandem with their power. Atticus Blaine was no saint. In fact, only the dead are deemed worthy of sainthood. Atticus did not covet power for its own sake, for he understood that the essence of power is power itself. Unlike wizards such as Cornelius Fudge, whose authority rested entirely on the fragile social order of the wizarding world, Atticus's desire for power was more profound. It stemmed partly from the inherent nature of beings and partly from the helplessness he felt when caught off guard. He yearned desperately for the ability to shape his own destiny. Now, the power to challenge fate lay tantalizingly close within his grasp. As his mindset shifted, the magical energy surrounding Atticus surged violently. His ambition, like a wild stallion, galloped through his heart, conjuring visions of his fulfilled dream, the establishment of an epic and magnificent magical dynasty. Wizards from across the globe gathered, gazing up at him with reverence from the clouds. Behind them, millions of muggles chanted his name, as if worshipping a deity. "What a beautiful vision," Atticus murmured, closing his eyes and spreading his arms to embrace the void. Since the dawn of civilization, no one could rival his achievements, and none had been stronger. He envisioned himself living eternally, his words inspired by the gods, his statue erected at the highest point on earth. His greatness would be etched into the annals of time, remembered through the ages, regardless of the world's changes. Only one step remained to achieve all this: to seize the staff of the two serpents and submit to its power. With its might, the hidden dangers of the magical world could be dispelled with a mere snap of his fingers. Albus Dumbledore himself would humbly bestow upon him the title of the greatest wizard of our time. "Just surrender," Atticus whispered, lost in his fantasy. He repeated the words surrender, his once straight back bending, his knees beginning to buckle, as if preparing to kneel before the staff. The two basilisks entwined around the golden scepter bared their fangs at Atticus, seemingly mocking him with silent laughter. The indomitable snake staff obeyed only its true master. Just as Atticus was about to succumb to his ambition and desire, a fiery red-haired Godric Gryffindor appeared in his mind's eye. The words Gryffindor had once spoken to him thundered through Atticus's consciousness, jolting his eyes open. In an instant, the illusory images shattered and vanished like bubbles, and clarity returned to his lavender eyes. Cold sweat trickled down his pale cheeks, and his heart pounded like a drum. Atticus staggered back, shaken. He had come perilously close to becoming a puppet of this artifact. "Horrifying," Atticus muttered, still trembling from the experience. Those brief 10 seconds had been the most perilous since he entered the wizarding world. The double snake staff only submitted to its rightful master. Was Atticus that master? Certainly not. Its true owner was the legendary dark witch Morgan Le Fay, or perhaps the shadow lurking behind her. Fay's body, not Atticus Blaine. Only with my help can you retrieve the sacred artifact belonging to the druids in the place of Merlin's eternal rest. Atticus, whose back was drenched in sweat, stared at Vicia Corona standing at the door, his face pale with tension. The pity he once felt vanished completely, replaced by an overwhelming urge to shout. Wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, Atticus turned to leave, intending to check if the passage he had just used to cut into the time barrier still existed. However, as he turned, his expression suddenly stiffened, and a look of pain crossed his face once more. Inside the barrier, the magic that lingered in the temporal gap suddenly surged, flowing through Atticus's body like a relentless tide. In a single breath, Atticus realized what was happening: a magic riot. He had encountered this phenomenon before, including the awakening of his magical power in childhood and the sudden surge of power due to emotional changes at Hogwarts a few months ago. This marked the third magic riot Atticus had experienced. This time, it was because he had successfully resisted the allure of the double snake staff. His reason had triumphed over the ambition to wield power beyond his capabilities. Magic power is rooted in the mind, and every successful mental cleansing can lead to unpredictable changes in a wizard's magic. For a talented wizard like Atticus, these changes were particularly pronounced. With prior experience, Atticus was more adept at handling such situations. The moment he understood what was happening, he activated the magic engraved in his eyes. The vortex within them spun rapidly, like an engine at full throttle, compressing and storing the invisible, cloud-like magic into his eyes. As this process continued, the purple hue in Atticus's eyes deepened. "What is this? A blessing in disguise?" he wondered, staring at his reflection in the water mirror. His eyes, now as pure as amethyst, had pupils that blurred into the surrounding color. Atticus scratched his head, bewildered. The sensation of magic filling his body and eyes, creating a faint swelling feeling, made him realize that his strength had increased once more. This didn't mean he could immediately overpower Albus Dumbledore, but his actual strength was now closer to the level he had been disguising. The problem is, how will I face people with this appearance? Even the most oblivious person would notice something odd about my eyes, Atticus mused. While he was pleased to have crossed another threshold in his magical journey, the side effects were troubling. If left unaddressed, his appearance would surely lead others to label him a freak. After some thought, Atticus turned his wand upside down and pointed it at his eyes. Wisps of silvery mist emerged from the wand's tip, floating towards his eyes and forming a layer of thin lenses near his eye sockets. As the mist dissipated, the color of his eyes faded visibly until they returned to their original state. Although this won't fool wizards of Dumbledore's caliber, it should suffice for others. "I must thank you, Professor Lockhart," Atticus said with a smile, exhaling deeply as he put away the mirror. End of this chapter. Chapter 124, The End of the Chamber of Secrets. Sure enough, I was given a... Atticus Blaine muttered through gritted teeth as he watched the stones vanish into the barrier. It was reasonable to speculate that since he could follow the Gryffindor time mark to penetrate the barrier and enter the inner space, this safe gap had existed for thousands of years. Now, after Atticus passed through, the gap mysteriously disappeared. No wonder the ancestors of the Druids have been unable to discover that rift for centuries. "It seems Godric Gryffindor left it especially for me," Atticus murmured, his voice tinged with a sinister edge. Without that passage, he couldn't leave the altar on his own, which meant that, aside from attempting to wield the snake staff again, he had few options. Atticus couldn't fathom why the founders of Hogwarts had left so many arrangements and contingencies just to thwart the purpose of the twin snake staff. Their actions, devoid of apparent reason, were difficult for him to endorse. After staring at the mysterious scepter for a long time, he sighed deeply, a sigh filled with helplessness. In the contemporary magical world, Atticus was considered a powerful wizard by any measure. However, compared to the giants of Hogwarts from thousands of years ago, and even more distant times, he had become a mere mythical figure. In the eyes of someone like Merlin, he was undoubtedly weak. Weakness is the original sin, an unbreakable truth in both Muggle society and the wizarding world. Blaming those wizards who had long been swallowed by time was futile. The fault lay in his own powerlessness. The island of Avalon had slumbered in the embrace of death for over a dozen centuries. During these long years, no one had set foot on this mythical island except the priests of the past. Vitia, with her arms wrapped around her knees, gazed toward the swamp, worry lingering in her shimmering eyes. From what she had heard and investigated, Atticus Blaine seemed to be a very powerful wizard, but this power was only impressive against the backdrop of the modern magical world. In the mythical ancient magic era, Atticus Blaine was not so remarkable. Deep down, Vitia harbored doubts about her teacher's divination. She couldn't understand why a wizard with no ties to Druidism was deemed capable of helping them retrieve the Hollows. Inviting Atticus Blaine to Avalon, risking the island's exposure, was more an act of desperation than anything else. Suddenly, a breeze stirred the dead air, causing the fine dust on the ground to dance and drift into the unknown. Vitia watched the swirling dust with a sense of loneliness, feeling as if her fate was as insubstantial as the dust. But wait, how could there be wind on Avalon Island, which had been silent for over 10 centuries? Vitia clutched her grapevine wand and stood up in alarm. She turned abruptly and saw a thin figure walking steadily from behind the rapidly dissipating time barrier toward the ancient altar. As he approached, Atticus Blaine, with a cold smile, raised his head. The snake wand, which had restrained its own malevolent magic, glinted ominously. "Fulfill your mission, Miss Corona," he said. When had Atticus Blaine entered the temple, and how had he broken through the time barrier that had stymied the ancestors of the priests? These questions seemed insignificant now. She stared blankly at the scepter, her slender body trembling slightly. For over a dozen centuries, countless ancestor priests had sacrificed, and innumerable congregants had perished. Death and blood clung to them like a curse. Despite her efforts to maintain a facade of calm, she couldn't help but cry out, "Give it to me!" Crystal-clear teardrops hung in the air, reflecting Vitia's hysterical despair, and hatred twisted her beautiful face. Atticus Blaine's eyelids fluttered slightly, and his heart throbbed with a hint of empathy. Yet he remained still, not moving forward. His tone was calm, tinged with indifference. "I have some doubts, Miss Corona. Unless you can address them, I believe it's best to keep this scepter in my possession." Atticus's firm refusal ignited Vitia's anger. The magic emanating from the staff she wielded was formidable. It seemed that if Atticus refused to hand over the snake staff, she would not hesitate to strike him down. "Anger often drives us to foolish actions," Atticus remained unmoved. "And foolish actions often come with a heavy price. Miss Corona, do you wish to test this truth with your own actions? Most wizards active in the underground world of Nocturne Alley consider you a wizard who values credibility. Even without mentioning it, we have signed a magical contract, Mr. Blaine." Atticus's cold words were like a chilling wind, gradually restoring Vitia's reason. Her rationality struggled against the tragic memories of the past, keeping her on the brink of collapse. "You need to give me the sacred artifact belonging to the Druids from the place of Merlin's eternal rest. If you violate the contract, you will face severe consequences. Even a wizard like you cannot withstand the backlash of breaking a contract. Magic follows rules, and I cannot escape the constraints of the contract." Atticus nodded slightly, acknowledging Vitia's statement. But before Vitia could express any joy, he let out a cold chuckle. "However, there is a minor loophole in the contract, Miss Corona, and I'm sorry you didn't notice it. The place where Merlin sleeps forever, the final resting place of Merlin. Can you tell me where his grave is, where his body lies? Miss Corona, if you can't provide a reasonable explanation, then it means this staff of 2 snakes was merely found on the island of Avalon, not in the land of Merlin, regardless of whether it is a holy weapon of druidism or not." As he observed the stunned and speechless druid priest, Atticus, who had been overshadowed by these schemes, finally allowed himself a satisfied smile. "You, who always prefer the solitude of the woods, may not realize how complex the outside world truly is, Miss Corona." End of this chapter. Chapter 125, The End of the Secret Realm. As Atticus Blaine's words echoed through the vast empty hall of the temple, an inexplicable chill began to permeate the air. The 2 adversaries stood 50 feet apart, each locking eyes with the other, their gazes filled with unyielding determination. A fierce conflict seemed inevitable. Atticus maintained an indifferent expression. Though confident in his own strength, he had never faced a druid before. He remained wary, uncertain of what unexpected powers Vitia might wield. Suddenly, a searing heat emanated from his palm, causing him to pause in surprise. His expression shifted dramatically. From the moment he resisted the temptation of power and disconnected the double snake staff from the earth, it had behaved like an ordinary magic staff. There was no resistance or strange phenomena, and Atticus had easily pulled it free. Once he possessed it, the time barrier surrounding the altar dissipated, leaving him in disbelief. Without warning, the 2 basilisks on the staff opened their orange eyes, and an irresistible force surged from the icy staff, reminiscent of the earlier incident when Gryffindor's grasp was repelled. With no time to spare, Atticus, anticipating the danger, hurled the snake staff into the air and summoned a massive silver metal shield to protect himself. The sudden turn of events left Vitia equally astonished. She watched the staff spinning in midair, hesitated briefly, then cast aside her doubts and summoned her golden staff with reckless determination. The vision of a millennium was realized before her eyes, leaving Vitia speechless. Yet the transformation of the double snake staff continued. The golden staff radiated a heart-pounding gray magic power, and the basilisk clung to it, spewing thick black smoke. The smoke coalesced in midair, forming a figure resembling the Grim Reaper, which stared down at the helpless Vitia Creona. A majestic hum reverberated through the temple, and Atticus's expression grew solemn. He recalled the mural depicting the legendary Black Witch Morgan Le Fay, who, when on the brink of defeat by Merlin and King Arthur, had unleashed a lurking shadow from within her. Why? Why did you do that? The shadow's hum carried a revelation that Atticus couldn't comprehend. It seemed to contain unbelievable information, gradually transforming the bewilderment in Vitia's green eyes into shock. She involuntarily asked, "What the hell did you hear?" The mysterious scene unfolding in the temple's empty hall made Atticus frown. He sharply questioned Vitia, sensing something amiss. The druid priestess appeared to have heard something utterly absurd, her pupils wide with astonishment. Her expression suggested that the revelation from the shadow emerging from the double snake staff was something she resisted. In response to her defiance, the shadow's hum grew more intense, as if commanding her to follow its absurd orders. "Tell me what it's saying." Although Atticus couldn't understand the ancient language, possibly unique to druids, his intuition told him something was wrong. He prepared to act. Vitia gradually regained her composure. She looked at Atticus, her eyes still filled with reluctance, yet he sensed an apology in her complex gaze. "I don't know much more than you do, Mr. Blaine. Anyway, thanks for getting it for us," she said as the black shadow continued its ominous presence. The mission had been completed, and the energy dissipated into the air. Before Atticus Blaine could react, the unmanned snake staff suddenly floated above Vitia's head and exploded. A gray circle of light emerged, and Vitia was instantly teleported away from the temple, vanishing from sight. "Wait!" Atticus shouted, rushing to the spot where Vitia had just stood, taking 3 strides at a time. He attempted to lock onto Vitia's position using the residual magic in the air, hoping to apparate and catch up. However, the chaotic magical magnetic field and spatial constraints within the secret realm were more formidable than any anti-apparition spell. Atticus's form blurred, as if he were about to be compressed into the air, but in the next moment he was forcefully repelled. "That woman!" Atticus nearly cursed in frustration. He wanted to try locating her again, but suddenly the temple shook violently. The abrupt weightlessness disoriented him for a moment. "Whoa! The secret realm is about to collapse," he realized. The magically created space was rapidly disintegrating, with shocking cracks appearing on the ground. The world began to tilt in Atticus's eyes. If he didn't escape before the secret realm collapsed, he risked being exiled to the chaotic void, never to return. With this in mind, Atticus dared not delay. He prepared to leave the hall immediately and head for the exit of the secret realm. But as he moved, he remembered something and turned his gaze to the altar, where the silver sword of Grand Fendor lay. Outside, Stonehenge Park fell into an eerie silence. Hundreds of muggles stared in disbelief at the boulders that had suddenly fallen, and the young man in a peculiar robe who emerged from the swirling dust. Their thoughts were momentarily paralyzed. "Who are you, and what have you done?" stammered the Muggle tour guide, who had been professionally narrating the history of Stonehenge. He looked at the ashen-faced young man with a mix of fear and curiosity. Atticus, momentarily dazed, glanced at the sun hanging high in the sky, radiating light and heat. He and Vitia had entered the secret realm in the dead of night, only staying for a few hours at most. Yet it was already noon when they emerged. "What is today's date?" Atticus asked the Muggle guide quietly. "July 7th, sir," the guide replied. 5 days have passed? Is the flow of time different between the inner and outer spaces?" Atticus murmured to himself. At that moment, a snow-white owl that had been circling high above for days swooped down, landing on Atticus's shoulder. It tilted its head and pecked his cheek, as if it had been waiting for quite some time. Ignoring the murmuring muggles, Atticus opened the letter the owl had delivered. After a brief glance, a few fine lines appeared on his forehead. "Thank you, little one. I already know," Atticus said, smiling at the owl and nodding in gratitude. The clever owl pecked Atticus's earlobe with its beak, urging him to hurry, then flapped its wings and quickly vanished from sight. Nearby, a commotion arose as several Muggle policemen pushed through the crowd, rushing toward the damaged historical relic. Atticus turned and waved his wand, resetting the boulders to their original positions. Then, with an apologetic nod to the bewildered muggles, he said, "I'm sorry to have disrupted your tour. I'll just leave, and you can forget about this. P.S. In the next 10 chapters, I will resolve one or two of the early foreshadowings." End of this chapter. Chapter 126, The Peculiar Uncle Vernon. For most young wizards from magical families, summer vacation at Hogwarts is a delightful time. At home, they can forget about those tedious magic courses, sleep in until noon, and after lunch, take out their brooms from the shed to fly freely over the lawn, savoring every moment of their holiday. The homework assigned by their professors poses little challenge, as their fathers and brothers, who graduated from the same school, easily guide them through it. Additionally, families with a reasonable income often take their children to explore magical landmarks during the summer, broadening their horizons. Harry longed for such a life, as his time with the Dursleys was dreadful in comparison. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and their son Dudley were Harry's only relatives, but given a choice, Harry would have preferred growing up in an orphanage. He wasn't ashamed of this thought. After all, an orphanage wouldn't have confined him to a cupboard under the stairs for years. Their mutual disdain reached its peak when Harry was accepted into the prestigious wizarding school on his 11th birthday. At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the student Harry despised most was undoubtedly Draco Malfoy from Slytherin. The Malfoy family was notorious in the wizarding world for their disdain of Muggle-born or half-blood wizards. In stark contrast, Uncle Vernon and his family loathed anything related to magic, akin to the superstitions of the Middle Ages, wishing to banish all magical people and things. On many nights, as Harry hid under his covers, completing his summer homework by flashlight, he imagined the chaos that would ensue if the Dursleys ever encountered the Malfoys. Of course, this was merely a fantasy, as the two families were unlikely to ever meet. Today was Saturday. Harry had nearly stayed up all night, working on a dissertation about the shrinking potion, assigned by the most irksome professor at Hogwarts. Consequently, he overslept and missed the Dursleys' usual breakfast time. When Harry hurried downstairs to the kitchen, he found only a few empty plates smeared with grease. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley were gathered around the television. This was hardly surprising. With Dudley present, it was wishful thinking to expect any food left after a late start. Seeing Harry at the top of the stairs, Dudley, who resembled a young whale with a tuft of golden hair, proudly flaunted a cream cake. The cream smeared around his lips almost mirrored Uncle Vernon's bushy mustache. "Well, I had a nightmare last night, so—" Harry began, but Dudley interrupted with a spray of cream, his broad shoulders shaking with laughter. Aunt Petunia, with her horse-like face, discreetly nudged her darling under the table to stop him from mocking Harry. Surprisingly, Uncle Vernon, who usually relished berating Harry, didn't shout about his ingratitude. Instead, he pointed a short purple finger at the kitchen counter. "There's some bread and fried eggs left for you, boy," he said, panting heavily. His massive frame, even larger than Dudley's, heaved with the effort. Atticus Blaine tried to suppress his anger. "Okay," he said, glancing at the dry slices of bread. He knew that Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia must have paid a hefty price to keep this little morsel away from Dudley's grasp. Perhaps it was a new gaming computer, a remote-controlled airplane, or something similar to the brand-new color TV now hanging on the kitchen wall. If this had happened last summer, Atticus would have been shocked by even this small gesture of kindness from the Dursleys. Their unusual behavior had been ongoing for 2 weeks, and at first, Atticus thought it was because they were in an exceptionally good mood. During the first week of summer vacation, Uncle Vernon's company had gifted him a new car, which they parked conspicuously in the garden, ensuring the neighbors on Privet Drive could see and envy them. However, Atticus soon realized that this wasn't the reason for their behavior. Based on his years of that experience, no matter how much the Dursleys celebrated, they never treated him well for more than 2 days. Dudley turned his head towards the TV screen, but his ears perked up. Atticus sat in his usual spot, silently munching on a slice of bread, pretending not to notice the exchanged glances between Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. He was acutely aware that they were planning something, but he resolved to remain silent and finish his breakfast quickly. He wasn't sure if the outcome would be favorable, and if it turned out badly, he feared the Dursleys might withhold food from him for a while, as they had done before he went to Hogwarts. "How are you doing, boy?" Uncle Vernon finally spoke, after what seemed like a silent agreement with Aunt Petunia. He appeared deeply ashamed of what he was about to say, his shoulders trembling with each syllable. Atticus tensed up, sensing he was about to uncover the mystery that had puzzled him for some time. Uncle Vernon's questions seemed endless, and Atticus was momentarily stunned before he roughly guessed what Uncle Vernon was referring to. His emerald green eyes widened in shock. If there was one taboo in this house, it was discussing anything related to magic. In the past, Atticus had often accidentally breached this taboo. He even considered pinching his cheek to see if he was dreaming. "You mean at Hog?" Atticus began to blurt out, but seeing Uncle Vernon's face turn from red to purple and Aunt Petunia's shoulders tense, he quickly corrected himself. "Learned something. Well, I'm only in the 3rd grade after the summer vacation, so there are still many things I don't understand." The kitchen fell into an awkward silence. Dudley tried to appear indifferent to the topic, but his antenna-like ears betrayed his true interest. Aunt Petunia stared blankly at the greasy plates on the dining table, her face gloomy. Uncle Vernon, meanwhile, clenched his fists tightly on the table, struggling to swallow the shame this conversation brought him. The scene was unsettling, and Atticus felt that enduring hunger for a few days would be worth it if it meant escaping this situation. Yet deep down, he was eager to understand why Uncle Vernon had broached the subject. Aunt Petunia, who had always despised magic, spoke to him about it for the first time. "Boy." Uncle Vernon finally broke the silence, but his question only plunged Harry into deeper confusion. "Is there a way for you people to heal others?" End of this chapter. Chapter 127. Another Mr. Blaine. Harry didn't respond immediately. He was still reeling from the astonishing moment when Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had voluntarily brought up the subject of magic. The bewilderment in Harry's eyes, however, seemed to Uncle Vernon like mockery and provocation, pushing his already frayed nerves to the breaking point. "Answer my question, boy." Uncle Vernon finally erupted, his voice booming at Harry. Oddly enough, this familiar growl was almost comforting to Harry's ears. "If you mean minor issues, like boils on the face, insomnia, or some minor injuries, maybe I can help," Harry replied hastily. No one enjoys being hungry, and Harry was no exception. If he could avoid angering the Dursleys, he would, despite their mutual dislike. Although he didn't understand their sudden interest, he answered truthfully. "That's all you can do?" Dudley sneered, and Aunt Petunia interjected, eyeing Harry with suspicion. "What if it's a more serious problem?" Aunt Petunia's questioning irked Harry. He was just a young wizard who had completed only his 2nd year at Hogwarts. What did they expect from him? Moreover, healing often involved potions, a subject Harry was notoriously poor at. "A more serious problem, if you mean poisoning," Harry began, recalling a vague memory from his 1st-year potions class. Snape had mentioned something with strong detoxifying properties. Harry frowned, straining to remember. It wasn't that he was eager to showcase his skills to the Dursleys. He simply didn't want to give them a reason to ridicule magic. At that moment, Harry missed Hermione. If she were here, her answers would surely leave the Dursleys speechless. "It's not poisoning, kid," Uncle Vernon bellowed, his face turning a deeper shade of purple. "It seems those spells haven't made you any smarter." Harry, now splattered with Uncle Vernon's spittle, felt his temper flare. He met Uncle Vernon's gaze defiantly and retorted, "There are countless problems wizards can handle. How am I supposed to know what you're asking about?" "Let me talk to him, Vernon." Aunt Petunia intervened nervously, ushering Uncle Vernon and a reluctant Dudley into the living room before returning to the kitchen. She glared at Harry sternly and snapped, "You should show respect to every member of this family. If we hadn't taken you in out of the goodness of our hearts, you'd be a homeless boy sleeping under a bridge." Harry remained silent in the face of Aunt Petunia's reprimand. He had heard similar remarks countless times over the years. Whenever he questioned them, they would remind him mercilessly that without their charity, he would have ended up in a Muggle prison. For the next 10 minutes, Aunt Petunia's scolding rained down on Harry like a torrential storm. It was all the same old rhetoric, and even Dudley, who usually relished seeing Harry scolded, grew bored and shuffled off to the living room to watch another TV. As Aunt Petunia paused, breathless and claiming fatigue, Harry, who had stubbornly refused to turn away, asked sullenly, "What do you want from me?" Faced with Harry's question, Aunt Petunia hesitated, her expression shifting slightly. Petunia remained silent for a moment, her expression unusually tense. Harry sensed that discussing the topic required considerable courage from her. Just as he was about to prompt her again, Aunt Petunia finally spoke, her voice slow and hesitant. Her already long face seemed to stretch even further as she said, "There's a hospital that specializes in treating all kinds of difficult diseases." "A hospital for intractable diseases?" Harry echoed, confusion clouding his eyes. He wondered if such hospitals existed in the wizarding world, but soon he realized how foolish his question was. Of course, there must be hospitals in the wizarding world. It was just like when he learned from Malfoy last year about Azkaban, a prison that instilled fear in wizards at the mere mention of its name. These were basic facts for children raised in wizarding families. Harry was certain Ron Wu needed to know the name of the wizarding hospital. For young wizards, it was considered common knowledge. "If I remember correctly, it's St. Mungo's." Aunt Petunia continued, her voice as light as possible, trying to mask the pain and shame of recalling those dreadful events. Harry was about to express his surprise but stopped himself, realizing that the woman before him was his mother's sister. Growing up, she must have heard about the magical world many times. "Oh yes, you remember correctly. It's called that," Harry replied, trying to sound calm despite the anxiety in his heart. He was lying, of course, because he didn't know the hospital's name. His reasons were simple. He wanted to understand why the Dursleys were discussing magic with him for the first time, and he felt a strange sense of pride. Despite receiving a formal magical education at Hogwarts, Aunt Petunia knew something he didn't, which was hard for him to accept. In the living room, Uncle Vernon, who was watching TV with Dudley, coughed twice. In the kitchen, Aunt Petunia took this as a cue to hasten the conversation. She looked at Harry, her green eyes meeting his, and spoke as calmly as she could. "I think you remember the company where your uncle works, right?" "Grunnings. They manufacture drills," Harry replied quickly, glancing toward the living room. Aunt Petunia nodded slightly, appearing satisfied. "Then you should also remember who the boss of this company is, right? We've mentioned him many times when discussing your uncle's work." This time, Harry's response was less immediate. He frowned, thinking for a moment before slowly saying, "Atticus Blaine. What's wrong with him?" "He has cancer," Aunt Petunia said heavily. End of this chapter. Chapter 128. The reason Atticus Blaine, the owner of the drilling rig company where Uncle Vernon works. If it had been 2 or 3 years ago, Harry would have been able to recall his name without hesitation, even though he had never met the man. It's not unusual, is it? When you frequently hear your family discussing someone and their stories, you tend to form a vivid impression of this stranger. In truth, frequently might be an exaggeration when describing how often the Dursleys talked about Mr. Atticus Blaine, as they seemed to mention him almost constantly. Whenever Uncle Vernon spoke of the admirable benefits of his company and its growth over the years, he would always mention Mr. Blaine and his wise decisions with the utmost respect. That reverent and humble tone reminded Harry of the house elf named Dobby from the Malfoy family, who had shown him a similar attitude the previous school year. However, during the 2 summer vacations since Harry had started at Hogwarts, he noticed that the Dursleys hadn't discussed Mr. Blaine as much. It turned out that Mr. Blaine had been diagnosed with a serious illness. "Oh, that's unfortunate," Harry said, frowning in surprise. "When did it happen?" 2 years ago, or maybe 3 or 4, Aunt Petunia replied dryly. "Anyway, this news has only recently spread in your uncle's company." Before that, Vernon and his colleagues were puzzled as to why Mr. Blaine wasn't showing up as often. Previously, he was punctual almost every day, assigning work tasks to Vernon and guiding them on their efforts. Hearing this, Harry finally understood what the Dursleys were planning. They hoped to use magic to cure the illness of the owner of the drilling rig company. But was this even allowed? Harry pursed his lips tightly. He knew that the wizarding world had strict laws prohibiting wizards from revealing magic to muggles. His roommate and best friend at Hogwarts, Ron, had a father who worked in this area. We're not allowed to show magic to muggles. I mean, people who don't know about magic. You know, you've all seen it. Last summer, I received a warning letter, Harry said, his mind racing. If the circumstances were right, Harry wouldn't refuse to use magic to save a life. But if the cost was expulsion from Hogwarts or imprisonment in that dreadful magical prison, then it was worth reconsidering. I've discussed this with Vernon, Aunt Petunia continued, her voice breathless as they reached the core of the issue. If anyone troubles you, we'll explain it. Many of Vernon's colleagues are desperately seeking doctors with exceptional medical skills. Of course, it's unlikely the problem can be completely cured, but if we can help Mr. Blaine last a few more days or regain some energy, you know what we mean. Vernon has been in a supervisory position for years. He's very capable and should be showcasing his talents in a higher role. Aunt Petunia repeated emphatically, we think you should do something about it, and I believe you probably do too. After all, without us, you'd be out on the streets. Harry felt a wave of resistance. To be honest, he didn't want to get involved in this troublesome matter, but Aunt Petunia, having already spoken, seemed unwilling to let the opportunity slip away. You must know people who have dealt with this kind of illness. What does that hospital called St. Mungo's usually do? Vernon and I will handle the financial aspect, as long as they can provide some effective medicine. Aunt Petunia asked, her question hanging in the air. Harry didn't know how powerful St. Mungo's hospital was in dealing with such illnesses, but he was certain that the situation was more complicated than Aunt Petunia realized. Atticus Blaine was deep in thought, pondering a question that had been nagging at him. Are there any wizards who have ever had cancer? He racked his brain, sifting through all the information he had absorbed about the wizarding world since his introduction to it. Despite the countless conversations, the wizarding magazines and newspapers he had read, the tangents in his professor's lectures, and the tales Madame Pomfrey shared about peculiar ailments while he lay in the school hospital, none seemed to touch on this particular topic. You need to learn to be grateful, boy. Uncle Vernon's voice shattered the silence, his anxiety about the future manifesting in anger. He stomped on the wooden floor of the living room, nearly cracking the kitchen door frame with his forceful slap. We keep you from starving. He bellowed from the kitchen doorway. We give you clothes, send you to school, and even let you have Dudley's old bedroom. If you knew how to spell grateful, you'd be happy to say it. Atticus felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to retort, you took me in because Muggle laws required it, and you sent me to school because it was free. Dudley didn't want those clothes or that bedroom. But he held his tongue, fearing that if he spoke out, the Dursleys might lock him in the cupboard under the stairs until he came of age, never allowing him to return to Hogwarts. I have a condition. After a prolonged silence, Atticus finally looked up at the panting Uncle Vernon, his expression somber. You have to give me back my magic books. I need to finish my summer homework. How dare you make demands? Uncle Vernon roared, slapping the doorframe again, his voice dripping with venom. Look at your messy hair. You don't know how to be grateful. I always knew your true nature, boy. Vernon, the neighbors will hear, Aunt Petunia warned in a low voice, her eyes fixed on Atticus. Her chest puffed up with indignation, clearly angered by his defiant attitude. But Atticus stood his ground, tired of hiding under the covers at night, scribbling his homework by flashlight. If he didn't seize this chance to reclaim his magic books, he could only imagine the wrath of his potions professor when the new term began. You have to promise. Aunt Petunia finally relented, her face flushed with anger. She gritted her teeth, spitting out each word. You won't make any strange noises, and you mustn't mention your affairs in front of the neighbors. No problem. Atticus's heart raced as he quickly agreed. It felt like a significant victory to make the Dursleys relent, but he added, I need to see what's going on with this Mr. Blaine first. Under Aunt Petunia's suddenly suspicious gaze, Atticus shrugged. I need to understand the situation before I can ask my friends to look into it. All right, Uncle Vernon conceded reluctantly. unable to find fault with the request. "Your Aunt Dudley and I plan to visit tomorrow. You can come with us, but I warn you, boy." Uncle Vernon leaned in, his massive frame looming, eyes glinting with menace. "Mr. Blaine is a very respectable gentleman. If you cause any trouble in his house, I promise you'll regret ever being born." End of this chapter. Chapter 129, Blaine Manor. Why did I agree to this? Atticus Blaine muttered to himself as he collapsed onto his bed, exhausted. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, and he had just removed his glasses, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. He regretted his decision deeply. His fatigue wasn't due to a day of general cleaning or tending to the garden, mowing the lawn and fertilizing the delicate flowers in the fenced flower beds. In fact, the Dursleys hadn't assigned him any housework at all. The real reason for his exhaustion was the relentless training he had undergone since breakfast. The Dursleys had insisted on preparing him for his visit to Blaine Manor the next day, fearing any potential mishaps. They drilled him on everything from walking gracefully, smiling appropriately, and greeting with the right tone, to mastering dining etiquette. Their incessant chatter was as tedious as the history of magic lessons taught by the ghostly professor at Hogwarts. Though the bedroom lights were off, the living room downstairs was still brightly lit, with the occasional rustling noise breaking the silence. Aunt Petunia was frantically sewing a decent outfit for Atticus. Before bedtime, they realized he didn't own a suitable dress for mingling with high-class society. With the shopping malls closed and it being too late to buy one, Aunt Petunia's mind raced for a solution. For the sake of her husband's future and the family's prosperity, she remembered the outfit they had bought for Dudley last summer to entertain the builders, Mason and his wife. Dudley had worn the brand-new suit only once, as he outgrew clothes rapidly. Aunt Petunia decided to alter it, hoping to fashion 2 or 3 outfits for Atticus from the material. "Why did I agree to this?" Atticus grumbled, burying his head in the quilt and pounding the bed in frustration. Yet deep down, he knew why. It wasn't just about retrieving his magic book and broomstick. It was also about teaching the Dursleys a lesson. They had always dismissed magic as mere trickery, which infuriated Atticus. But this situation presented an opportunity. If he could help, perhaps the Dursleys would begin to respect magic. This might make his remaining summer vacations before graduating from Hogwarts a bit more bearable. With these thoughts, Atticus drifted into a deep sleep, lulled by the sound of the sewing machine. "I hope you all understand the importance of today's visit," Uncle Vernon declared the next morning. The golden sun was still casting a chilly light as the family gathered in the living room to hear his speech. "If I had secured that deal last year, we would be living in a luxury villa in Majorca by now. But due to unforeseen circumstances, we missed that golden opportunity to change our lives." Atticus, wearing a suit for the first time, felt awkward and kept his head down. He knew exactly what Uncle Vernon was referring to, but it wasn't his fault. Who could have predicted that Dobby would appear and throw a cake over the heads of that Muggle couple to prevent him from returning to Hogwarts? The visit to Mr. Blaine had the Dursleys on edge. As they drove their new car to Blaine Manor in London's affluent Mayfair district, an oppressive silence filled the vehicle. Even the usually boisterous Dudley was quiet, sensing the gravity of the occasion. Dudley was incessantly adjusting the elaborate patterned cravat around his invisible neck. Harry, firmly wedged against the car door by Dudley's bulk, felt the tension in the air and grew a bit anxious himself. He tried to recall how Madame Pomfrey would question him each time he was admitted to the school hospital. "What's wrong with me?" As they entered the Mayfair district of Westminster, it seemed as though even the sky turned a deeper shade of blue. Unlike other residential areas in London, this place was sparsely populated, and the fresh air carried the invigorating scent of roses. Aunt Petunia rolled down the car window, gazing enviously at the expansive green lawns lining both sides of the road. Elegant Dies strolled leisurely with their expensive dogs, chatting and laughing without a care for household chores. This was the life Aunt Petunia dreamed of. At the end of the immaculate road stood a sprawling, luxurious manor. Its pure white facade and golden embellishments gleamed brilliantly in the sunlight. In the center of the manicured lawn before the manor, a towering fountain soared 60 feet into the air. A row of maple trees lined the courtyard wall, where dozens of gardeners busily pruned the overgrown branches and leaves. "This is it," Uncle Vernon murmured. Dudley ogled the scene greedily, his pudgy face pressed against the car window, but Harry remained uninterested. Though the manor was undoubtedly the most opulent he had ever seen, in his heart the grey Hogwarts castle was his true paradise. "I'm Vernon Dursley, here to see Mr. Blaine. We have an appointment," Uncle Vernon announced to the stern-looking guard at the large iron gate. Harry stifled a laugh. He had never seen Uncle Vernon speak to anyone with such deference. Since outside vehicles were not permitted inside the manor, Harry had no choice but to walk with the Dursleys, who carried flowers and fruit baskets. As they made their way along the cobblestone path, Dudley nervously pinched his drooping eyes, glancing around, but not daring to utter a word. He clearly understood that this was not a place where he could throw tantrums or flaunt his personality. Perhaps due to the owner's grave illness, the atmosphere grew more solemn as they approached the manor. Even the staff they passed wore serious expressions as they bent over their luggage, their faces marked with dignity. From this, Harry surmised that the health of the manor's owner was likely in dire straits. "Ah, Mr. Lawrence," Uncle Vernon exclaimed, his face flushed and glistening with sweat. He hurried ahead, leaving Aunt Petunia to walk stiffly behind. He approached a thin figure with slick, oily hair and a small mustache perched above his lips. The man wore a perfectly pressed suit and appeared quite elderly. "That's Mr. Blaine's butler," Aunt Petunia whispered, tilting her head slightly. "He's been conveying Mr. Blaine's instructions for the past 2 years and is highly trusted. Remember to show him respect, especially you." Harry knew the "you" in Aunt Petunia's reminder was directed at him. He glanced at the butler and for some reason was reminded of Filch, the unpopular caretaker at Hogwarts. Perhaps they're both in similar roles, Harry mused, forcing a smile at Lawrence. End of this chapter. Chapter 130, Photos. The interior of the house was as magnificent and luxurious as its exterior suggested. Each piece of mahogany flooring in the spacious living room gleamed as if it had just been polished to perfection. A grand chandelier, crafted from thousands of pure crystals, hung from the 50-foot ceiling, casting a dazzling light as the sun streamed into the room. Lawrence, the manor's butler, guided the nervous Dursleys to the right of the living room, navigating a few turns before stopping in front of an elevator hall. Vertical elevators were typically found in Muggle shopping malls and high-rise office buildings, so even Harry was taken aback to see one here. It was clear that Uncle Vernon's boss was indeed a very wealthy man. "Sorry, Vernon." Lawrence began as the elevator came to a halt on the 3rd floor with a soft ding. As they stepped out, he turned to the Dursleys, who were all smiles, and said apologetically, "Mr. Blaine is currently undergoing treatment. According to the doctor's instructions, he won't be able to see you for about 2 hours. Could you please wait in the living room for a while?" "Of course, Mr. Lawrence." Uncle Vernon nodded eagerly. "We'll follow your arrangements." Once several young maids had served them tea and closed the living room door, a collective sigh of relief filled the elegantly decorated space. Uncle Vernon, who had been holding his breath, collapsed onto the plush sofa, exhausted. "What a splendid house, Vernon!" Aunt Petunia's voice quivered with excitement. "I dare say, if Evan knew I had been a guest in such a gorgeous manor, she would be green with envy." Harry raised an eyebrow. Evan was a close friend of Aunt Petunia, and both shared a penchant for neighborhood gossip. "Mr. Blaine inherited the manor and the drilling rig company from his father," Uncle Vernon explained to Aunt Petunia and Dudley. "He was only in his early 20s at the time, and everyone doubted him. They thought he would ruin the already struggling company, but who would have thought he'd pull it out of the mire with his ingenuity and hard work?" Uncle Vernon had recounted this story countless times at home, so much so that even Harry knew it by heart. Yet Uncle Vernon never tired of repeating it. "That's admirable. How did I do, Mom and Dad?" Dudley stood up, attempting to smooth the creases on his shirt. After a few futile attempts, he gave up and looked at his parents with a self-satisfied grin. "Brilliant, my darling," Aunt Petunia exclaimed, wrapping her arm around Dudley's. Tears of pride glistened in her eyes. "You showed no disrespect at all, a perfect little gentleman." Just like his father, who has seen many grand occasions. Uncle Vernon chuckled. Dudley puffed out his chest with pride and glanced at Harry, who sat quietly with a blank expression. Suddenly, a mischievous glint appeared in Dudley's eyes. "Oh, but it seems one of us here is a bit overwhelmed, isn't he?" Dudley taunted. "Even if I were scared, I wouldn't show it," Harry retorted, quickly realizing Dudley was referring to him. Anticipating another round of reprimands from the Dursleys, he hastily added, "Yesterday, you reminded me several times not to wander around without permission and not to utter a word." "All right, kid, you do have some memory." Uncle Vernon grumbled, though his tone soon turned authoritative again. "When you meet Mr. Blaine, you know what to do, right?" "I know," Harry replied sullenly. "Observe Mr. Blaine's condition carefully. When? Make sure to inquire about Mr. Blaine's health subtly, and listen carefully so you don't miss a word," Uncle Vernon instructed, sipping his black tea from an elegant cup. He nodded in satisfaction. "Once the meeting concludes, I'll inform Mr. Rep, Blaine's butler, that we have a friend skilled in handling this illness. Everyone knows it's usually a dead end, but Lawrence is at a loss now. If you assure him that someone can rejuvenate Mr. Blaine's spirits, he'll be eager to persuade Mr. Blaine to give it a try." When Uncle Vernon had made this specific request yesterday, the first thing that came to Harry's mind was a refreshing potion. It was safe, had no side effects, and was quite common in the wizarding world. He had consumed it many times himself. Harry was confident that if he wrote to Ron, he could easily procure a large batch. However, the main concern was whether it would violate the wizard's secrecy law to provide a wizard's potion to unsuspecting muggles, and how serious the infraction might be. On his way there, Harry pondered these issues. He guessed it might not be a grave offense. After all, there were many Muggle-born wizards in the wizarding world, and those wizards had Muggle family members. What would their families do if they faced ailments that Muggle hospitals couldn't effectively treat? Most likely, they would resort to magic. Another factor that emboldened Harry was an incident from his second year. When Dobby had closed Platform 9 3/4, causing him and Ron to miss the Hogwarts Express, they had no choice but to fly Mr. Weasley's magically modified car to Hogwarts. Ron's father, Mr. Weasley, was in charge of preventing wizarding misconduct, yet he had led by example in breaking the rules. This taught Harry that not all wizards, whether in private or public, strictly adhered to the rules. "Oh, look at this picture, Petunia and Dudley," Uncle Vernon exclaimed, trying to pass the time. He wandered around the living room, examining the commemorative photos on the walls. He paused in front of a gray and white photo near the door, pointing at it. "This is a photo of Mr. Blaine and everyone at the meeting when he first took over the company. He was quite dashing at that meeting, and many girls in the company admired him. Ah, I was really slim back then, under 200 pounds. Yeah, only more than twice as heavy as me," Harry thought, glancing at Uncle Vernon's rotund figure with a hint of sympathy. The Dursleys' home was filled with photos of Dudley, but there were very few of Harry, and those were mostly confined to his bedroom, a place he was strictly forbidden to enter. Before he went to Hogwarts, Aunt Petunia even handled the cleaning of both Dudley's and Harry's rooms. As Harry sat obediently on a chair watching the three adults animatedly discuss the photo, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. Just as he was wondering if Uncle Vernon had indeed been slimmer in his youth, the living room door opened quietly. The old butler, who had previously escorted them, reappeared. Though he maintained his polite and kind demeanor, a deep worry was etched on his brow. "Mr. Blaine is tired, Vernon, and the meeting should last no more than 5 minutes, the butler advised. Uncle Vernon nodded and promised to comply. After the butler exited the living room, Uncle Vernon turned to Harry, gesturing for him to follow. "Come along, kid. This place is enormous, and if you get lost, it might take ages for the staff to find you." If only they could see it, Harry thought, imagining leading the Dursleys to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He wanted them to witness the grandeur of the castle firsthand. Rising slowly, he walked toward the door, his expression sullen. As he passed by the photo Uncle Vernon had mentioned earlier, he glanced at it almost instinctively. Clang! The sound echoed through the room, drawing everyone's astonished gaze. Harry, unfazed by the blue swelling on his forehead, stood there, mouth agape. His eyes were fixed on the man standing amidst the crowd in the photograph. In a whisper filled with disbelief, he uttered, "Professor Blaine?" End of this chapter. Chapter 131. Writing a Letter. In the beginning, Atticus Blaine was merely an investigator appointed by the school board to delve into the Chamber of Secrets incident at Hogwarts. For reasons unknown, he later became the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for a brief period. Having spent 2 academic years at Hogwarts, Harry, who had experienced 3 different professors for this course, could confidently assert that Professor Blaine was undoubtedly the best of the trio. Of course, considering that one of the other professors had been possessed by Voldemort and the other was a notorious fraud, it wasn't a high bar to surpass. However, many senior students and other Hogwarts professors remarked that Professor Blaine was the most competent Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in the past decade, which spoke volumes. Moreover, Professor Blaine was the most powerful wizard Harry had ever encountered. Harry would never forget how, in the Slytherin chamber, the basilisk that had exhausted him was effortlessly dispatched by Professor Blaine, as if it were a mere goblin. Of course, Harry believed that Headmaster Dumbledore was even more powerful, although he had never witnessed Dumbledore in action. His belief was unwavering. Midway through the second semester of Harry's second year, after the Chamber of Secrets incident was resolved, Professor Blaine abruptly left Hogwarts, and no news of him surfaced thereafter. His departure was as enigmatic as his arrival. Many students, including Harry, Hermione, and Ron, were saddened by his departure, but they understood it was Professor Blaine's choice, and everyone has the right to choose their own path in life. The owner of Uncle Vernon's drilling company, Cullard Blaine, had been on Harry's mind since he recalled the name the previous morning. Despite sharing the same last name, Harry couldn't immediately connect him to Professor Blaine. The surname was common among both Muggles and wizards, much like Voldemort's original name, Tom, which was also the name of the owner of the Leaky Cauldron. Was there a connection between them? The shared surname, the same gray hair, and nearly identical facial features suggested a familial link, much like the resemblance between Harry and his father. Those who knew his parents often remarked on the likeness upon meeting him. Professor Blaine grew up in an orphanage. Harry's thoughts were interrupted as the Dursleys, taking advantage of the old butler's distraction, glared at him for his earlier blunder. Harry paid them no mind, his thoughts consumed by the photograph he had just glimpsed. If he truly is Professor Blaine's father, how could Professor Blaine, with such an enviable and prominent family background, have ended up an orphan? Harry pondered, casting a suspicious glance at the old butler named Lawrence leading the way. If not for the Dursleys' stern warning against speaking out of turn, Harry might have already inquired about any lost children from the manor. They followed Lawrence to a room on the top floor, where medical staff in white coats moved in and out, their expressions grave. As the door opened, Harry wrinkled his nose at the unpleasant smell of potions. Eager to see inside, he nearly pushed past Lawrence, who was informing Uncle Vernon that they had only 5 minutes. The room was stark and filled with various Muggle medical equipment. Harry's gaze was drawn to the scene before him. Blocked by a ventilator placed beside the bed, Atticus Blaine's appearance was obscured from view. As the nurses exited the room one by one, Lawrence led the group inside. When they finally stood before the bed and saw Atticus's condition, everyone, including Harry, gasped in shock. If not for the unintelligible curves dancing on the computer screen next to the hospital bed, they might have mistaken him for a shriveled corpse with shaved hair. The figure on the bed was emaciated and unrecognizable, resembling a skeleton draped in a thin layer of skin. Uncle Vernon, who had rehearsed his greeting countless times in his mind, found Harry himself speechless, as if choked by an invisible hand. Aunt Petunia, who had intended to compliment Mr. Blaine on his appearance, was similarly struck silent. Even Dudley, who had never seen anything like this before, was at a loss for words. Harry realized there was nothing more to observe. He wouldn't have been surprised if Mr. Blaine passed away at any moment. "It seems my appearance has frightened you, Vernon," Mr. Blaine said, his voice weak and strained through the breathing mask, making it impossible for Harry to guess his age. "You're mistaken. I mean, you seem to be in good spirits, Mr. Blaine," Uncle Vernon replied, forcing an awkward smile on his flushed face, while a mix of emotions brewed within him. After all, the man on the hospital bed had been his boss for many years, a man he had always admired. Now, seeing this wise figure lying there, dying, Uncle Vernon regretted his private schemes. He realized that allowing Mr. Blaine to die peacefully was the most dignified course of action. 5 minutes passed swiftly, and as they left the ward, everyone subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. Lawrence, the manor's elderly butler, escorted them back to the gate and arranged for someone to drive Uncle Vernon's car. While waiting, Harry noticed the Dursleys appeared listless, and his curiosity got the better of him. He sidled up to Lawrence and softly inquired, "Perhaps it's presumptuous of me, sir, but does Mr. Blaine have any children? Why aren't they with him?" The old butler looked at the polite child with surprise, raising his gray eyebrows, but his voice carried a note of regret. "Mr. Blaine was never married, child." Although Harry had lowered his voice, the Dursleys overheard the abrupt question. Yet neither Uncle Vernon nor Aunt Petunia reprimanded him. The car ride home was silent, with no conversation exchanged. Harry pondered his thoughts, and the Dursleys refrained from questioning him. The silence persisted until they arrived home. Uncle Vernon turned on the TV to watch the morning news rerun. Aunt Petunia went into the kitchen to prepare lunch, and Dudley rummaged through the refrigerator for a snack. Harry, standing by the stairs, was ignored by everyone, as if nothing had happened. "I need to open Hedwig's cage," Harry declared, breaking the silence. Unlike before, when he relished the Dursleys' deliberate neglect, this time he sought their attention. Before Uncle Vernon could growl or Aunt Petunia could reprimand him, Harry firmly stated, "I need it to deliver a letter for me." End of this chapter. Chapter 132. The Visit. On the morning of July 29th, a Sunday, the weather was as bright as the day before. The dazzling sunshine bathed the clean and tidy Privet Drive, where rows of well-kept private gardens lined both sides of the road. The brightly colored flowers swayed gently in the breeze, competing for attention. Inside, the air was a bit stuffy. Harry, feeling extremely irritable, kicked everything related to his potions homework off the bed with a thud. He turned over to face the birdcage hanging on the window grill. Every year around this time, Harry felt particularly irritable. It was understandable. The last day of July marked his birthday. However, his uncle and aunt were never considerate enough to hold a birthday party for him. The only acknowledgement of his birthday might be a slight reduction in his housework duties for the day. This year, though, his irritability stemmed from a different reason. Clang! A sudden, strange noise from the street outside startled Harry, who had been dozing. He jumped up to the window, only to see a garbage truck collecting trash cans along the road. Disappointed, he sat back on the edge of the bed, dejected. "Are you sure you delivered that letter?" he asked, directing his question to Hedwig, who was resting in her birdcage after a long journey. The owl, hearing Harry's voice, fluttered her eyelids, cooed a few times in dissatisfaction, and tucked her head under her wing to continue resting. Harry sighed heavily and stared blankly at the lights and shadows on the white wall, lost in thought. Half a minute later, a slight explosion echoed through Privet Drive. Atticus Blaine, dressed as a muggle, suddenly appeared on the street, holding a wand. He quickly scanned his surroundings to ensure no muggles had seen him. Once satisfied, he breathed a sigh of relief, pocketed his wand, and surveyed the scenery with interest. A few steps away, a bronze sign in front of a house indicated his exact location, 7 Privet Drive. After confirming the address mentioned in the letter, Atticus walked towards the house at a leisurely pace. Standing in front of the house, he didn't rush through the garden to knock on the door. Instead, he paused to admire the blooming roses and agapanthus, basking in the golden sunshine and inhaling the strong fragrance of the flowers. Once he felt completely calm, he knocked on the door with a smile. Tuk, tuk, tuk. 10 seconds after his gentle knock, hurried footsteps approached from inside. Atticus took a step back, patiently waiting for someone to answer. The woman who opened the door was remarkably tall and thin, with a long, gloomy face that left an impression on Atticus. "I'm sorry to interrupt your breakfast, ma'am," Atticus said, glancing at the steaming spatula in Aunt Petunia's hand. He maintained a polite smile and nodded. Harry Potter, who lives here, wrote me a letter explaining his situation and asked me to visit. Of course, if you'd prefer I come at another time, that's perfectly fine. Silence fell. Aunt Petunia stared at the young man standing 5 feet away, her expression shifting from doubt to dullness, and then gradually to panic. Before Atticus could speak again, she let out a gasp of horror. Screaming in disbelief, Aunt Petunia exclaimed, "Vernon, you must come and see! I swear I've seen the devil!" As she nearly crawled into the house, Atticus Blaine raised an eyebrow, not appearing too surprised. In fact, when he read Potter's letter mentioning that his uncle was a veteran of the drilling rig company, he had anticipated something like this might happen. "So," Atticus tilted his head, glancing at the chaotic living room where chickens were flapping about, "may I pretend to have accepted your warm invitation to enter the room?" In the kitchen, the dining table lay overturned, and the Dursley family huddled in a corner, watching the young man who had entered with silent trepidation. "Oh my God!" Atticus exclaimed, standing in the living room as he watched Potter nearly leap down the stairs. "It's only been 4 months since I last saw you, Potter, and you've grown so much taller. Have you been secretly drinking height-enhancing potions?" "Professor Blaine," Harry wheezed, looking at Atticus, who appeared almost unchanged except for his attire. His voice trembled with excitement. "You really came. I thought Hedwig might have lost the letter I wrote or delivered it to the wrong person." "Oh, your owl is very clever, Potter," Atticus replied with a smile. He glanced at the messy kitchen, snapped his fingers crisply, and watched as the collapsed dining table creaked and twisted back into shape. The scattered bacon and fried eggs spun themselves clean and returned to the restored dinner plate. Once everything was back in order, Atticus looked apologetically at the Dursleys, who had climbed onto the kitchen counter in fear. "Sorry, folks. I seem to have given you quite a shock." Uncle Vernon's small eyes bulged as he stared at Harry, as if seeing him for the first time. Although Harry had much to say to Professor Blaine, the Dursleys' expressions made him laugh. He looked at Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, who were trembling with ghostly expressions, and Dudley, who was hiding behind them, clutching his backside. Feeling playful, Harry said in a nonchalant tone, "Yeah, I got someone to fix it." Harry nodded. "This is what I promised you." "You really are Mr. Blaine," Uncle Vernon said gruffly. "He's a young man." Vernon, Aunt Petunia, who was evidently more astute, whispered into Uncle Vernon's broad arms. "He knows their stuff." Dudley muttered from behind Uncle Vernon's back. "He knows their stuff." "Come down first, all 3 of you," Atticus said with a grin, glancing at Harry and then at the Dursleys. "If you don't mind, we can have breakfast together. I'm still hungry." End of this chapter. Chapter 133. Yes, I know. The restored, neat, and orderly kitchen was shrouded in a peculiar atmosphere. Under its influence, the Dursleys, the owners of the house, remained silent. The focus wasn't on Harry, who was hurriedly recounting the incident, but on Atticus Blaine, who was calmly dealing with a fried egg. When Harry expressed his confusion about whether wizards ever suffered from cancer, Atticus put down his knife and looked up. "No, Potter, wizards don't get that kind of disease," he said. "Why, Professor Blaine?" Harry asked, still accustomed to addressing him by his former title, despite knowing that Atticus was no longer the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts. "I don't understand this disease, Professor, but I don't think it should be because we are wizards. It's because of magic," Atticus replied, swallowing his food and speaking calmly. "This involves the fundamental difference between wizards and muggles. Like muggles, the cells in our bodies are constantly at risk of disease, but our bodies contain a high concentration of magic that muggles do not possess. Magic is a remarkable force, acting like a unique immune system within a wizard's body. When it detects diseases that have evolved naturally, magic spontaneously eradicates the source of those diseases." Noticing Harry sitting upright as if he were in class, Atticus smiled. To be honest, despite Dumbledore's occasional teasing, he had enjoyed his return to Hogwarts earlier that year. Most diseases that lack abnormal magical properties cannot affect wizards. Additionally, magic has a subtle effect of enhancing physical fitness, which is why you'll find that, barring illness or disaster, most wizards with strong magical abilities tend to live long lives. Like Headmaster Dumbledore, Harry exclaimed, his eyes still slightly confused, but now more engaged. Atticus rolled his eyes playfully, but nodded with a smile. Across the table, Aunt Petunia listened, her eyes betraying a trace of envy amidst her fear. As the conversation continued, Uncle Vernon, occupying nearly half of the seat on the other side of the table, clenched his fists beneath the table, his suppressed breathing growing heavier. He seemed to be reaching the limits of his patience. In truth, if it weren't for the young man's striking resemblance to Mr. Blaine, Uncle Vernon might have already politely asked him to leave. But this resemblance puzzled him. The young man must be Mr. Blaine's son. It didn't take much deduction for Uncle Vernon to reach this conclusion. The eyes might have been inherited from his mother, but the facial features, soft gray hair, and overall appearance were almost identical to Mr. Blaine's. It would be baffling if they weren't father and son. Yet Mr. Blaine had no known heirs, a fact confirmed by his housekeeper, Mr. Lawrence. Uncle Vernon, having spent most of his life at the drilling rig company, was well acquainted with the family situations of every longtime employee, especially their immediate boss, Mr. Colored Blaine. Could it be that Mr. Blaine had an illegitimate child, unknown even to the loyal old butler Lawrence? Uncle Vernon blinked his pig-like eyes, convinced he had stumbled upon an explosive truth. If Mr. Blaine had no other heirs besides this illegitimate son, why had he never considered? Why would they bring him back when he was so ill? After all, he had such a vast family business with no one to inherit it. As Uncle Vernon watched the young man enjoying Petunia's breakfast and chatting with her annoying nephew, he turned his head, pondering this question quietly. Suddenly, Uncle Vernon's eyes widened, and he held his breath as a possibility struck him. From the conversation, it was clear that this man had once been a professor at that peculiar school, which suggested he was the kind of eccentric, attention-seeking person they all detested. Surely, Mr. Blaine must have known this. There was no doubt that Mr. Blaine was a respectable man, so he would never acknowledge or reveal such a shameful, illegitimate child until his death. Atticus Blaine, sensing something, glanced casually at Uncle Vernon. His expression shifted, wondering why the man, who had been confused and fearful of him moments ago, now exuded a sense of superiority. Also, the child, who was almost a miniature version of him, had been acting strangely since he arrived. What was wrong? Could it be that someone had influenced him to misunderstand? I saw a photo in the living room, yes, Harry paused, reluctant to admit his connection to the Dursleys in front of Professor Blaine, just as the Dursleys were ashamed of their connection to him. It's a group photo of all the employees at Uncle Vernon's company from years ago, and the boss is in it too. Then you notice that the owner of that drilling company looks almost exactly like me? Atticus, now half full, gracefully wiped the corners of his mouth with a napkin and nodded appreciatively to Aunt Petunia. Your cooking is excellent, Miss Petunia. I haven't had such a delicious breakfast in a while. Aunt Petunia, despite the compliment, showed no sign of happiness. She pursed her lips and looked down at the plates, eager to see this man leave, even if he might be connected to Vernon's boss. Yet, she dared not say a word. So how is he doing now? I mean, Coulard Blaine, Harry asked, not surprised that Professor Blaine was concerned about the health of Uncle Vernon's boss. What surprised him was the casual, indifferent tone in which Professor Blaine mentioned the name, as if discussing a stranger. It's terrible, Professor. It could be any time. Harry trailed off, confident that Professor Blaine understood. Watching Professor Blaine's inscrutable expression, Harry hesitated before asking, You knew about Mr. Coulard Blaine all along, didn't you, Professor? Because you don't seem very surprised. Atticus exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair and gazing at the spotless ceiling. He tapped his fingers on the table, creating a dull, oppressive rhythm. Yes, I know, he finally replied. I've known about Mr. Coulard Blaine for a long time. But I heard from Hagrid that you grew up in an orphanage? Harry asked, his mouth agape in disbelief. Yes, Potter, Atticus replied, looking down at Harry with an enigmatic smile. I did grow up in an orphanage, and those two things don't conflict at all, do they? End of this chapter. Chapter 134, Gloomy. After a few days, Harry found himself once again standing before the opulent and grand Blaine Manor. The last time he was here, he had been accompanied by the Dursleys. This time, however, his companion was Professor Atticus Blaine. "Professor," Harry whispered, pointing to the large iron gate and eyeing the two guards warily. "If we hadn't made an appointment in advance, I'm afraid they wouldn't let us in." "Oh, never mind, Potter. We'll find a way," Atticus replied, his mind momentarily drifting back to memories. Harry's reminder brought him back to reality. He began to walk towards the manor with a nonchalant air, and Harry followed, uncertain of what Professor Blaine's plan might be. He suspected that using magic might not be the best approach. "We are here to visit the owner of the manor. Could you please open the gate?" Atticus asked politely, standing before the stern-faced guards clad in black suits. Harry, astonished, wondered if this was truly Professor Blaine's method. The leader of the guards, a burly muggle, scrutinized the familiar young man and the child beside him, sensing a vague familiarity. "Sorry, gentlemen, we didn't receive any prior notice of a visit to Mr. Blaine today. Perhaps your appointment didn't go through, or you might have the wrong time," the guard said, his fierce demeanor surprisingly polite. After all, most visitors to this place were distinguished members of the upper class, and he likely didn't want to offend them. "Perhaps Lawrence forgot to inform you," Atticus suggested with a confident smile. "You can check with him again. Tell him that Miss Belina Duder's son is here to visit Mr. Blaine. I believe he will let us in." The guards exchanged puzzled glances. They were well acquainted with the meticulous work style of the manor's old butler. If these two unexpected visitors truly had an appointment with Mr. Lawrence, it was unlikely he would forget to mention it. Yet, the confident smile on the young man's face made them hesitant to challenge their assumptions. "Very well, sir. Please wait a moment," the security foreman said after a moment's hesitation, then hurried off to the manor to seek confirmation. "See, Potter," Atticus said, waiting in the shade of an ash tree with its lush taupe bark and cracked surface. "Not everything has to be solved by magic." Harry rolled his eyes discreetly, choosing not to comment on Professor Blaine's lofty statement. Instead, he asked quietly, "Miss Belina Duder, who is she, Professor Blaine?" "As I said, Potter," Atticus replied, gazing over the tall buildings of the luxurious manor at the pure, unblemished sky and towering clouds. His voice was slightly less crisp as he continued, "That's my mother." The manor's actual manager, the loyal old butler who had served the Blaine family for 2 generations, arrived sooner than expected. Seeing the aged Lawrence rushing towards the gate faster than the security foreman in his prime, Harry was taken aback. During their brief meeting last time, Harry had perceived this old butler as someone the Dursleys would admire, meticulous and polite, with elegance seemingly etched into his very being. But now, this old butler, who usually took every step with measured precision, was running wildly. Not only was Harry surprised by this sight, but even Atticus's calm and unwavering eyes showed subtle changes. "Where is that gentleman?" Lawrence, with gray hair clinging to his sweaty cheeks, shouted at the bewildered guards from dozens of feet away, not even pausing to catch his breath. As their eyes met, Lawrence was momentarily taken aback. He gazed at the expressionless young man standing in the dappled shadows of the trees, his eyes almost greedily tracing the familiar, handsome features now marked with freckles. His nose tingled with emotion. "It's you," he murmured, his voice soft and reverent. The old butler approached slowly, his tone almost delirious with disbelief. Harry observed the old butler, whose eyes were red with excitement, then glanced at Professor Blaine, who remained remarkably composed. Betui's eyes widened in astonishment. "It's you, without a doubt. You are the spitting image of the master in his youth," the old butler exclaimed, seeming to age 10 years in an instant. He moved closer to Atticus Blaine, ignoring Harry entirely, and reached out with a trembling hand as if to touch Atticus's cheek. "So similar. I've been searching for you for so many years." "I hope you don't mind our unannounced visit," Atticus said, stepping back to avoid the butler's touch, his voice steady and unwavering. His calm demeanor was like a splash of cold water, bringing Lawrence back to his senses. "You know everything, young master. I mean, did your mother tell you everything about that year?" Lawrence asked, his eyes never leaving Atticus's face, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Master? What do you mean, Lawrence? Atticus replied helplessly. If you prefer, just call me Atticus. Atticus, Lawrence repeated, his old frame trembling at the name. That's the name of Miss Belinadette's father. Let's find a simpler way to communicate, Atticus suggested, frowning slightly in frustration. Truthfully, he was unsure how to dismiss the old butler. Taking a deep breath, he glanced at Harry, who was wide-eyed and inexplicably excited. Harry, in good spirits, patted him on the shoulder and addressed Lawrence. I think you might recognize this young man, Harry said. His name is Harry Potter. He visited here with the Dursleys last week. In the living room, he happened to notice that a photo of the manor's owner in his youth bore a striking resemblance to me. So he wrote to me and mentioned it. Oh, by the way, I'm the boy's teacher. I taught him a bit of self-defense. Harry rolled his eyes discreetly and remained silent. Out of curiosity, I decided to come with him to see for myself. Of course, if our visit is an inconvenience, we can leave now. Leave? Oh, absolutely not, Lawrence exclaimed, suddenly invigorated. He grasped Atticus and Harry's arms, turning to Harry with a trembling voice. You're Vernon's nephew, aren't you? Oh, my boy, I can't thank you enough. Oh, Harry replied, a hint of shyness in his voice. You're welcome, sir. I really didn't do much. Above, a large, thick cloud was driven toward the sun by a wind heavy with moisture, casting the magnificent and elegant manor into shadow as the golden sunlight faded. As Lawrence led Atticus toward the house, Atticus glanced up at a window on the top floor, his calm expression gradually giving way to a more complex array of emotions. End of this chapter. Chapter 135, Father and Son. Lawrence gently closed the door, leaving Atticus Blaine alone in the cold room with only the rhythmic ticking of a Muggle machine and the sleeping man on the hospital bed. As Atticus gazed upon the frail figure whose life was nearing its end, his body trembled involuntarily. His once indifferent expression transformed into one of deep complexity, as if a heavy stone weighed upon his heart. He moved slowly to the window, drawing back the curtains and opening the sash to let the cool breeze carry away the unpleasant odors of potion and decay. Leaning against the window, Atticus took out a cigarette, sniffing it before his calm gaze settled on the man's thin, triangular cheeks. How sad, Atticus sighed after a long pause, his words laden with unspoken meaning. Perhaps it was the cold wind that disturbed the man on the bed, for he began to stir, muttering incoherently. With great effort, he opened his eyes, staring blankly at the white ceiling. It took several minutes before clarity returned to his cloudy eyes. Realizing he was not alone, he turned towards the window, squinting against the glare to discern who had dared to open it. As the cool breeze sharpened his senses, the blurred light and shadows receded, revealing Atticus's face. The man's eyes widened in recognition, his gaze locked with Atticus's in a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. Could you get me a cigar? The man rasped. Since my diagnosis, Lawrence hasn't let me have one, but I suppose it doesn't matter now. Atticus discarded his cigarette and replied lightly, No cigars, but we can make do with this. The man reluctantly accepted the slightly bent cigarette, placing it in his mouth with trembling hands. Fire, he muttered. With a crisp snap of his fingers, Atticus lit the cigarette, and wisps of green smoke curled into the air. The man inhaled deeply, savoring the nicotine as his grayish-brown eyes regained a spark of life. Even his frail body seemed to gather some strength as he shifted to a more comfortable position against the headboard. What was that just now? A trick? He asked. Consider it a trick, Atticus replied lazily. For someone who might not see another day, nothing in the world seemed novel. The man nodded, choosing not to pursue the matter further. So, he began, the smoke straining his already fragile organs. He coughed, wiping blood from the corners of his mouth as if it were nothing. After catching his breath, he continued with difficulty. It was Lawrence who found you, wasn't it? I know he's been searching for you behind my back, especially since my diagnosis. He spent a lot of energy on this. Atticus took out another cigarette, feeling a strong urge to light it, but he resisted, merely toying with it in his hand. If I were you, he said with disinterest, I wouldn't waste my remaining days on such trivial questions. The man nodded in agreement and fell silent. The cigarette in his hand burned quickly, its ashes falling away. Burning black and ugly spots marred the snow-white quilt. What kind of life are you living now? This time, it was Atticus Blaine who broke the silence. He rubbed his brow, his usually steady gaze flitting around the room. How should I answer your question? Atticus sighed. A free life, a life full of hope. It's not bad anyway. Really, the man whispered. That's good. Both seemed to lose the desire to speak. The man on the hospital bed savored what he knew would be his last cigarette. He watched the slow, steady flame consume it, memories flickering through his mind. They finally settled on a blurred face. He longed to see through the fog obscuring it, but no matter how hard he tried, the mist remained. He could only laugh at himself. I can't even remember what she looked like. It's not difficult to understand, Atticus said calmly. After all, many years have passed, and I can't remember clearly either. There was a hidden message in his words, and the man on the hospital bed who caught it was stunned. He asked, So you, our mother, is she already? You guessed it right, Atticus nodded. She's been gone for many years. Perhaps due to his habit of practicing occlumency when his emotions were turbulent, Atticus's tone remained incomprehensibly calm. His composure was both dazzling and infuriating to the man, but upon reflection he realized he had no right to say anything. So, seeing the man had nothing more to say, Atticus straightened from his reclining position. He nodded at the man. Have a good rest, Mr. Blaine. I'm leaving now. The words Mr. Blaine stung the man's self-esteem like fire. His breathing quickened, and an inexplicable strength surged through him, like a candle flickering in the wind. Do you hate me? Atticus paused at the bedside. He gazed into the man's eyes for a long moment before replying, There is nothing to complain about, Mr. Blaine. After all, you are just an innocent victim. The man slumped back onto the bed, his expression deflated. The strength that had surged through him moments ago quickly ebbed away. He seemed to hear the footsteps of death growing clearer. Could you call Lawrence for me? The man asked, stopping Atticus as he reached the door. I have something to explain. Note, updates will be released at night in the future. First, I will make up for the first leader of the book. I don't see the moonlight staining the sky, and I will address the rest as soon as possible. End of this chapter. Chapter 136. Those Stories. The deafening rumble of thunder echoed across the land, and the torrential rain cast Bryan Manor into an oppressive darkness. Atticus Blaine, upon returning to the private living room, noticed Harry sitting in a daze, the exquisite snacks on the coffee table untouched. Professor Blaine, Harry snapped out of his stupor as Atticus entered the room. Though curiosity flickered in his eyes, the serious expression on Professor Blaine's face made him hesitate to probe too deeply into his secrets. Shall we leave now? Harry asked, resisting the urge to inquire about the meeting's outcome. He appeared uneasy under the weight of the tension surrounding Atticus. Atticus walked to the window, gazing at the relentless rain. After a moment, he said, The old butler, Lawrence, invited us to have lunch. Given this dreadful weather, I think it would be wise to stay here for a meal. At least we won't have to brave the rain to find a car. Harry immediately recognized the lie. Professor Blaine was a powerful wizard, capable of keeping himself dry if he wished. However, Harry chose not to expose the falsehood, merely nodding awkwardly. Atticus closed the window, brushed the raindrops from his clothes, and sat beside Harry. He took a moment to admire the room's opulent decor. A crystal chandelier, velvet carpet, cedar wood coffee table, and even the teacups, which were exquisite porcelain from China. A luxurious abode, Atticus murmured, casting an appreciative glance around the room. He expected Harry to agree, but instead, Harry was peeking at him cautiously. After a moment's thought, Atticus leaned back in his chair and asked with a chuckle, I suppose you're curious about my connection to the owner of this manor? I don't quite understand, Professor. Harry replied hesitantly. You mentioned growing up in an orphanage, yet you seem to know a lot about this place. Do you have a connection to the manor? Well, Atticus began, picking a snack from the table and popping it into his mouth. How should I explain this to you? Although I didn't defeat the Dark Lord Voldemort as you did, Potter, I have my own unique abilities. Unique abilities? Harry asked, blinking with curiosity, momentarily forgetting Professor Blaine's teasing. Yes, Atticus nodded. I possess an exceptional memory. You might wonder what makes it so special. Even muggles have individuals with remarkable memories, but they aren't like me. From the moment I first opened my eyes in this world, I have remembered everything that has happened to me." It took Harry a few seconds to grasp what Professor Blaine meant. His eyes widened in shock, a mix of disbelief and amusement on his face. "You mean you remember everything from your birth? I've never heard of anyone doing that." "Ah, yes, it's quite rare," Atticus admitted, spreading his hands toward Harry. "But there are always exceptions, so it's not difficult to understand why, despite being an orphan, I know the blood ties between the owner of this manor and myself." Harry took a while to process this astonishing revelation. Among all his friends, Hermione was undoubtedly the brightest. She could memorize entire textbooks and recite them backward after a long time, but Harry was certain even Hermione couldn't remember her own birth. "So you do know why they—" Harry hesitated, his voice trailing off. Atticus Blaine finished the sentence for him. "Abandoned you?" "Oh, sorry, Professor." Harry quickly stood up, apologizing earnestly. "I didn't mean to pry into your personal matters." Atticus gestured for Harry to sit back down, reassuring him not to worry. Gazing out the window at the relentless rain, he frowned slightly and said, "Perhaps we need a topic to pass the time before lunch. I don't mind discussing my origins, I just find it a bit tedious. But since we need something to talk about—" Harry pursed his lips, suspecting that Professor Blaine was merely looking for an excuse to share his story. Although Harry wasn't an orphan, he often felt like one, especially when he longed to tell others about his difficult life with the Dursleys. He had shared these stories with Ron and Hermione, who reacted with disbelief and anger, yet neither could truly empathize. Life often felt lonely. Harry suddenly recalled something Professor Blaine had once said to Hermione. Perhaps the professor meant that some pains are burdens one must bear alone. "Your mother and your father, they sacrificed their lives to fight against the evil threatening our world, to stand against Voldemort. Their bravery is truly admirable. Even after more than a decade, people still speak of them with great respect," Atticus said in a soothing tone. Harry felt a mix of happiness and sadness at Professor Blaine's words. He admired his parents' courage, but felt inadequate compared to the professor's unique talents. His knowledge of his parents came from Hagrid's gift of a photo album and the now-vanished Mirror of Erised. "Rebellious might not fully capture my mother's teenage years," Atticus continued. "At 10, she learned to smoke from some unsavory boys on the street and got a tattoo on her back. She stole, not out of necessity, but perhaps for the thrill. She often got into fights, and within 2 years, her record with the Muggle police was probably thicker than your history of magic textbook." Harry stared at Professor Blaine in shock. It was hard to imagine that someone as composed and polite as the professor could have such a rebellious mother. You can imagine the tears her behavior caused her parents. In an attempt to discipline her, they sent her to a renowned school for troubled teens. But it was futile. The chaotic environment only fueled her rebellious nature. After a few years, she was expelled for leading a group fight and was detained for a time. This was the final straw for her parents. When she returned home, they threw her belongings out and declared she was no longer their daughter. Atticus sighed heavily, as if feeling the weight of his mother's past. "In truth, my birth was entirely my mother's decision." End of this chapter. Chapter 137, Those Stories. A series of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the house. Atticus Blaine paused his recounting of the past, listening intently for a moment. His expression turned somber. The torrential rain outside continued to pour, with flashes of lightning occasionally illuminating the thick clouds. The air was heavy and oppressive. Harry held his breath, remaining silent, though his eyes betrayed a sense of urgency. He was eager to understand why Professor Blaine had claimed that his birth was entirely orchestrated by his mother. "Where was I, Potter?" Atticus asked, frowning as his thoughts momentarily faltered. "You mentioned that your mother was kicked out of the house, and there were plans," Harry quickly replied. "Oh, thanks," Atticus muttered, rubbing his temples. "I'm a bit muddled. It's not about clearing my mother's name. It's about provoking her, making her angry. She believed the root of their disapproval was their perception of her as worthless. She thought that if she became successful and made a lot of money, things would change. But we all know it's not that simple, especially for a young woman with limited education and a troubled past. The chances of her leading a respectable life were slim. With her personality, she couldn't endure the monotonous jobs that offered only meager wages. The clanking and rattling sounds in the corridor suggested someone was pushing equipment and running. Harry momentarily drifted from Professor Blaine's story, pondering the source of the noise, before quickly deducing the answer. He glanced at Professor Blaine, noting the increased speed of his speech and the urgency in his storytelling. It was clear that Atticus was aware of the commotion outside. She had been in society for some years and knew many people from different circles. Through these connections, she learned about a reception hosted by business elites. She dressed elegantly, posing as a wealthy and well-educated lady. She infiltrated the reception, quickly identifying the most distinguished man in the crowd. They shared a brief, passionate romance, during which she became pregnant. Her true identity was soon uncovered by the manor's old owner. To piece together these events, I nearly turned all of London upside down during my third-grade summer vacation. Atticus smiled wryly at Harry, who was staring at him, mouth agape. Rewind to December 1971. That winter was exceptionally long and cold. In previous years, the gentle spring breeze would have been caressing the expansive, well-manicured lawns of Blaine Manor. Now, everything lay buried under a blanket of snow and ice. On the straight path leading from the grand iron gate to the magnificent manor, over a dozen servants were busy clearing the accumulated snow and ice. Their progress was slow, as they whispered among themselves, their curious eyes fixed on the commotion at the gate. Clang! You've humiliated me like never before, Bellina. The young, handsome master of the manor slammed the door shut, glaring at the woman outside the iron gate with fury. Leave, and never show your face here again. Hearing these harsh words, Lawrence, the manor's steward, felt a pang of sympathy. He glanced at the woman at the gate, hesitating to speak. She was young and beautiful, with delicate features, but her disheveled hair, the dust on her cheeks, and the dried bloodstains on her inner thighs told a different story, a path cleared of snow. She approached the young woman with a gentle yet firm demeanor, her heart heavy with concern. "Excuse me, miss," Miss Verena called softly, her voice carrying warmth and understanding. "Do you need help? It's not safe for you and the baby to be out in this weather." Bellina paused, her eyes meeting Miss Verena's with a mixture of desperation and gratitude. The baby in her arms whimpered softly, a reminder of the urgency of their situation. I don't know what to do," Bellina admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go." Miss Verena nodded, her expression soft day. "Ning. Come inside, dear. We can offer you shelter and warmth. The baby needs to be taken care of." With a hesitant nod, Bellina followed Miss Verena into the orphanage. The warmth of the building enveloped them, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Miss Verena led them to a small room with a crackling fireplace, where she gently took the baby from Bellina's arms and wrapped him in a soft blanket. "What's his name?" Miss Verena asked, her eyes kind and attentive. "Atticus Blaine," Bellina replied, her voice filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "He's all I have left." Miss Verena smiled reassuringly. "Atticus is a strong name. He'll be safe here, and so will you." As Bellina settled into a chair by the fire, she watched Miss Verena tend to Atticus with care and tenderness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a glimmer of hope flickered in her heart. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but at least for now, she and her son had found a refuge from the storm. Felina navigated the slippery ground with caution, her eyes fixed on the door ahead. "Hi, ma'am," she called out to Bellina, who was walking away. "Do you need some help?" Bellina didn't turn around. She seemed lost in a world devoid of hope and sound, unable to hear anyone's voice. End of this chapter. Chapter 138. Good and Evil. The young woman carrying the child continued her path without a word, her steps unwavering. Felina, nearly 70, hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow. She quickened her pace, leaving footprints in the snow as she caught up. "Miss," Felina called out, reaching for Bellina's arm. Her eyes fell on the baby cradled in Bellina's arms, and she gasped, "Oh, this child!" Felina's voice was filled with concern as she looked at Bellina, who seemed lost in her own world. "Can't you see, ma'am?" This child is freezing. When was the last time you fed him? Belina regarded the old woman with indifference. Her gaze shifted to the orphanage sign hanging on the dilapidated building nearby. For a moment, her lifeless eyes flickered with emotion, but she remained silent. Felina frowned at Belina's strange demeanor. The young woman appeared to have endured much hardship, clutching her clothes tightly. "All right, wait here." Felina sighed heavily when no response came. She looked at the baby with pity. "Stay here. I'll fetch some clothes and food for this poor little one." With that, she released Belina's arm and turned to leave. However, Belina did not heed the old woman's instructions. As soon as her arm was free, she resumed her walk, moving forward with determination. "Hey, wait! What's going on with you?" Felina shouted, realizing Belina was leaving. She hurried after her, but age and the thick snow made her pursuit difficult. She stumbled through the snow, trying desperately to catch up with Belina, who had quickened her pace. Belina ignored the old woman's cries, driven by an inexplicable despair. The chase continued for about 100 feet until Belina stopped on a dilapidated arch bridge. The biting wind brought her back to her senses. She slipped on the snow, clutching her back in pain, and turned her gaze to the frozen creek below. Sensing danger, the baby in her arms cried out with all its might, a plea for salvation. "Shut up!" Belina's heart churned with despair and hatred, her face twisted with anguish. "You, like me, are a mistake in this world," she shouted, lifting the baby above her head. With anger and resolve, she stepped over the low guardrail of the bridge, ready to leap into the icy river. "Oh, damn it!" Felina, foreseeing the tragedy, pushed her frail body through the snow. Despite the searing pain in her back, she crawled to the bridge. As Belina prepared to plunge into the river, Felina lunged forward with all her strength, pulling Belina and the child back to the ground. They rolled across the snow-covered ground, and the coat wrapped around the baby loosened. The cold wind and snow quickly silenced the baby's cries, leaving only a faint whimper. "Go away, old man. This is my business, and it has nothing to do with you," Belina shouted, trying to kick away the elderly woman clinging to her ankle. "You mad woman," she muttered, as 2 kicks landed on her cheek. Felina, on the verge of fainting, clenched her remaining teeth and held onto Belina's calf with all her might, determined not to let go. However, her frail body was no match for the young woman in her 20s. After more than 10 seconds of struggle, a kick to her shoulder blade left her numb, and she involuntarily released Belina's leg. Fortunately, the scuffle had brought Felina closer to the baby lying in the snow. With a sudden idea, she rolled over and shielded the crying infant with her body. Despite the desperate situation, Belina seemed to lose herself in a frenzy. She roared like a wild animal, lunging at Felina, pulling her hair and kicking her arms while cursing loudly, showing no signs of relenting. Even as she was beaten, Felina remained resolute, using her frail body to protect the baby. The relentless assault continued for a full 2 minutes before Belina finally stopped, panting heavily. She looked at the shivering old woman before her, and the hatred in her eyes began to fade. "Why?" Belina asked blankly. "His father doesn't want him, and his grandparents refuse to take him in. His birth was a mistake, and he deserves to die just like me." "Damn you, but not this innocent child," Felina retorted fiercely, her eyes locked onto Belina's. Tears streamed down Belina's face as she forced a bitter smile. "You're right. I'm a total mess, and I deserve this, but he's innocent." Felina was momentarily taken aback, but before she could respond, Belina turned abruptly. She took 2 steps toward the other side of the bridge, climbed onto the guardrail, and leaped into the air. The scene unfolded so quickly that Felina didn't comprehend what had happened until she heard the ice crack and the splash of water. "Oh my God!" Felina gasped, suppressing the pain in her body. She clutched the baby tightly and used her other arm to support herself as she climbed to the guardrail. All she could see was a head bobbing in the icy water, surrounded by broken ice. "Someone help her!" Felina shouted desperately, but the howling wind and snow swallowed her cries, and her voice vanished into the storm. It was unrealistic to expect a nearly 70-year-old woman to jump into the river to save someone, and Felina knew this. She jumped up and down in front of the guardrail, shouting frantically, but no one came to her aid. "You're a good person, ma'am. I'm sorry for what I did to you. Please take care of this child. Belina called out, smiling through her tears as the icy water rose around her. You are his mother. You should be the one to do this. How can you expect an old woman with barely any teeth left to help? Philiana pleaded, still trying to save the young woman's life. Please, ma'am, Belina whispered, her eyes closing as the river engulfed her. The child's name is Atticus Blaine. And with that, the chapter came to an end. Chapter 139. Your mother, I mean that girl. When Professor Atticus Blaine finished recounting the story of how he became an orphan, Harry, who had been listening intently, realized he couldn't find the right words to describe the woman named Belina Detta. For years, the Dursleys had done their utmost to ignore and mistreat him, yet Harry had to admit they were, in their own way, devoted parents to their son Dudley. Belina, however, shattered Harry's understanding of what it meant to be a parent. She ended up being. Atticus paused, rubbing his fingers with a complex expression. She died. By the time Grandma Philena finally found help, Belina had already been swept away by the river, carried an unknown distance. The river was covered with ice and a thick layer of snow, so no one knew where she ended up. Harry thought to himself that this was a fitting end for her actions, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Outside, the torrential rain gradually subsided, and the antique clock against the wall ticked away the time. Throughout the story, no one interrupted their private conversation. Harry looked down at the luxurious velvet carpet beneath his feet and suddenly felt less unfortunate. Although his parents were killed by Voldemort shortly after his birth, he knew one thing for certain: they loved him. They had given their lives to protect him. "Do you hate them?" Harry asked. "I don't hate them," Professor Blaine replied, shaking his head. His answer left Harry speechless. "I don't hate them any more than I love them. I just think it's a very sad thing." The rain had passed, but the sky remained overcast. Atticus stood up, walked to the window, and pushed it open. He glanced at the crowd gathering in the yard below, squinted his eyes, and took a few deep breaths of the fresh air. The air and his mood gradually improved. "And your grandparents?" Harry asked after a long silence. "Have you ever tried to find them?" Atticus smiled at the birds flying past the window, stretched his arms, and replied in a lazy tone, "I asked their neighbors, and they revealed that not long after their daughter came to them with a child, they moved away. It's said they relocated to a city in the United States." Harry wanted to ask if Professor Blaine ever considered visiting his grandparents, but he realized it was a trivial question and remained silent. Just then, there was a knock on the door. After receiving permission from Professor Blaine, the door opened and the old housekeeper, Lawrence, entered with a stack of documents. Lawrence, who was always proper in his duties, didn't even glance at Harry as he walked past. Instead, he approached Professor Blaine by the window, bowing respectfully with a somber expression. Harry didn't mind being ignored by Lawrence, nor was he surprised by the butler's demeanor. It was understandable. "Master." Lawrence's eyes were red, and his voice was hoarse. "As I've said, Lawrence, my name is Atticus Blaine, not Master," Atticus corrected gently, looking at the old butler who had served 2 generations of the Blaine family. Atticus felt a mix of emotions. Lawrence might be the only person in the house he was willing to converse with. Lawrence pursed his lips, looking at the young man before him as if seeing Curad Blaine from 20 years ago. "As you wish," Lawrence nodded, sniffing. "In the past 2 years since Master Blaine fell ill, he has secretly sold most of the assets under the Blaine name. The Groning Drilling Rig Company, along with other family members, had generously donated to charity." Atticus Blaine raised his eyebrows, already anticipating what Lawrence would say next. "But just now, Master Brian changed his will, leaving all the money in this manor to you," Lawrence announced. Atticus smiled with keen interest and asked, "If it's not too much trouble, could you tell me how much money we're talking about?" "Stocks in 5 companies, 3 manors in London and Birmingham, villas in Majorca, luxury cars, antiques from around the world, yachts. The process was rushed, but I managed to get a rough estimate," Lawrence replied quickly, mentioning a staggering figure. Atticus rolled his eyes, nearly losing his composure. Even Harry, whose understanding of money was more aligned with galleons, sickles, and nuts, widened his eyes at the number, his heart skipping a beat. If the Dursleys knew, Harry thought, they'd faint from envy. "If you have no objections, these documents need your signature," Lawrence said, handing the papers to Atticus. "No need, Lawrence. Just handle it according to his previous wishes," Atticus replied, sidestepping the papers and heading toward the door. He placed an arm around Harry's shoulder, guiding him out. "Are we going to lunch, Professor Blaine?" Harry asked, puzzled. "Oh, I don't know why, but I've suddenly lost my appetite," Atticus said with a wink and a smile. "And since the rain should have stopped by now, I think we might as well leave." Neither Harry nor the old butler Lawrence seemed surprised by Atticus's decision. "Mr. Blaine," Lawrence called out, just as Atticus and Harry were about to disappear from view. Facing their questioning looks, he hesitated before saying, "Mr. Blaine, this house is the ancestral home of several generations of the Blaine family." Atticus nodded slowly at the loyal, gray-haired housekeeper. "In that case, Lawrence, you should continue to guard it for the Bryan family." "I won't say goodbye to your uncle and aunt, Potter," Atticus said as they stepped out of the taxi in front of number 4 Privet Drive. Noticing Harry's surprise, he explained with a smile, "Because I have a feeling your uncle and aunt don't particularly like me." "Oh, they don't like anything related to magic," Harry replied with a grin, which quickly faded into reluctance. "So where are you going next, Professor Blaine?" "Something happened a few days ago that changed me, so I'm planning to find a hotel to rest for a few days and get accustomed to the changes." "Oh, and perhaps I should find myself a place to stay as well," Atticus said, rubbing his eyebrows warily. "After that, I'm going to search for someone's whereabouts." With that, Atticus waved goodbye to Harry, who was still unsure of what was happening, and turned to leave. His figure quickly disappeared around the corner of the road. End of this chapter. Chapter 140. The Malfoy family's mansion is nestled in the picturesque county of Wiltshire, England. This expansive and exquisite estate spans several acres, surrounded by meticulously designed gardens. As a symbol of the family's prestige, elegant white peacocks roam the verdant lawns, which could easily double as a Muggle golf course. The garden is dotted with artistic statues and fountains, adding to its charm. At the heart of the manor stands a villa, both classical and dignified in its architecture. A dozen majestic white pillars grace the entrance, supporting the grand structure. Inside the spacious foyer, the walls are adorned with portraits of Malfoy family heads from generations past. The floor is laid with precious marble tiles, swirling in snow-white patterns, while the ebony doors and windows boast intricate carvings. Shaded by towering trees, the villa exudes an air of magnificence. As midnight envelops the manor, the stars cast a serene glow over the tranquil estate. The peacocks, perched in their grand gilded cages, occasionally let out crisp, joyful cries that enhance the peaceful ambiance rather than disturb it. Suddenly, a series of explosions shatter the stillness, and several figures materialize before the ornate wrought iron gate. Cloaked in black travel garments, their faces remain obscured, but the unmistakable scent of blood lingers around them. The leader of the group, a man with a disheveled beard and sharp yellow teeth, gazes at the illuminated villa. "This is it," he remarks with a mix of envy and disdain. "Truly luxurious. I hope the owner won't mind our peculiar scent." His voice carries a note of pride as he extends a hand from beneath his cloak, revealing a metallic silver arm. Under the moonlight, it gleams beautifully, though its form is grotesque, marred by pits and pustules, as if crafted by the clumsiest of artisans. Hatred flickers in his eyes as he surveys his arm, his breath growing ragged with emotion. "Just wait and see," he mutters through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure you pay." Inside the study, Lucius Malfoy sits in a high-backed chair behind his desk, observing the man who is greedily eyeing a peacock painting encrusted with thousands of precious stones. Lucius's displeasure is evident in his clenched fists. "How dare you?" Malfoy hisses, struggling to maintain his composure against the overpowering stench of blood and sweat emanating from the intruder. "How dare you storm into my home so brazenly, Greyback? Who gave you the audacity?" His voice is low and menacing. "Do you realize how many galleons it will cost me to resolve this mess if anyone finds out?" "Ah, galleons," Greyback responds, his eyes shifting to Lucius as he bares his yellow teeth in a chilling grin. "We all have a fondness for galleons." Lucius's breath quickens, a cold glint in his gray eyes, and a strange flush colors his pale cheeks. He recognizes the man before him as a dangerous lunatic, and he knows that losing his temper would be foolish. His priority is to rid himself of this unwelcome guest as swiftly as possible. "If it's gold you seek, Greyback, you can leave now. I'll have someone bring it to you," Lucius offers, his tone icy. "We've both served under you-know-who, Lucius." "We're old friends," Greyback replies, a fierce light flashing in his dark yellow eyes. He fixes his gaze on Lucius's neck, a predatory glint in his expression. Atticus Blaine studied the situation, contemplating the most appropriate angle to speak. Greyback extended his peculiar hand from beneath his cloak, flicking his sharp claws against the desk. The sound sent shivers down Malfoy's spine, and Greyback relished the fear in Malfoy's eyes. "We don't have many old friends left outside, Lucius," Greyback began, his voice dripping with mock nostalgia. "I came to reminisce about the happy and free days, but you act so coldly." If Lucius Malfoy were absolutely certain, he might not hesitate to draw the wand concealed within his scepter and cast a deadly spell on this fearless, unscrupulous werewolf. He could then return to the Ministry of Magic with Greyback's head and claim the Order of Merlin, first class. Unfortunately, Malfoy was not confident, especially with Narcissa and Draco resting in the bedroom upstairs. A confrontation could jeopardize their safety, and Malfoy was unsure if he could protect them completely. Ever since Lucius Malfoy encountered Atticus Blaine, who had retired from his position as a defense against the dark arts professor at Hogwarts, at the Leaky Cauldron, he had come to a stark realization. Wealth and influence were not omnipotent. The menacing werewolf before him only reinforced this understanding. Malfoy knew it was unwise to display hostility unless he was certain of victory. This had always been his guiding principle, but Greyback's presence intensified the fear Atticus Blaine had instilled in him. Malfoy rose silently, retrieved a bottle of red currant rum from the wine rack, and poured drinks for both Greyback and himself. He returned to his seat, his eyes still cold, but his tone noticeably calmer. "Tell me, your purpose for coming to me. Is this how you treat your friends, Lucius?" Greyback taunted, raising his glass with a triumphant smile. He toyed with the glass, experimenting with different grips, as if trying to master the etiquette of high society. "Just a small favor, old friend." The werewolf leader took a hearty sip, savoring the taste. "Everyone knows the Malfoy family is one of the wealthiest in the magical world, and you, Lucius, have many connections. Among our old friends still outside, only you can help us poor souls." Malfoy remained silent, observing Greyback's performance with icy detachment. "We want to use your network to gather some personal information, old friend. I don't think you'll refuse such a modest request, will you?" "Who are you asking about?" Malfoy inquired tersely, his eyelids flickering. "A cunning scoundrel whose real name eludes us," Greyback replied, a mad gleam in his eyes. He set down his glass and grinned wickedly. "He calls himself Golden Viper in his hideout. With your resources, old friend, I think it's a simple task, right?" End of this chapter.